Welcome everybody to day 7. We are one day away from completing our training, and so thank you everybody. Hello to Anne, Justin, Rain, Ayaz, Erin. Welcome everybody. I'm so excited to see you all again today and to be getting a little closer to completing the training. It's just been a complete honor to share this time with you all. We're gonna, Deb, if you want to go back a slide, I want to go over the what we're gonna go over, and then we'll go into the poll. Right, Shawnee? Woo! We have gone over quite a few modules up till now, and we have 4 more to go. So thank you so much for everybody taking time away from your busy schedules to share this time and space with us. And so for day 7, we're gonna have Morgan teaching on the understanding of sex trafficking. And we, of course, will take a little break in between there. And then we have the advocacy for LGBTQ and our Two-Spirit relatives. And then we'll close for the day. So with that, I just want to real quick want to say, if you're having troubles, and I want to try to get everybody adjusted right now before we move forward, we have spotlighting and pin and sharing screens, and sometimes this kind of will manipulate your screen a little bit. So I just want to remind everybody that the view option on the upper right, if you want to click on that, if you're not seeing what you want to see and if it's not comfortable or what you're used to seeing, the view option will give you a standard side-by-side speaker, side-by-side gallery. And so go ahead and mess with those. Sometimes it will switch out if we pin somebody else. So please feel free to get comfortable with that button up there, just so that you're seeing us what is comfortable for you. So I see we still have a couple people jumping in. It's awesome. All right, so thank you. We have not a poll, but we'd like you, it's a little fun. If you want to use the chat, if you had all the money that you need, what would you do? Next slide, Deb, so they can see that. Thank you. If I had all the money I need, I would. So use the chat feature to let us know what would you do. Dorsey, help others. Travel. Retire. Pay off parents' mortgage and vacation. I love that. Travel. I see a lot of travel. Me too. Oh, quick. Feel a sense of freedom, right? Buy a house for deaf survivors and long-term shelter home. Thank you, Mary. Build more housing for people. I'd order takeout every day. Give everyone else what they need. Go on vacations, travel, take in more. What's cat W? Save some and share with those that don't. Travel, help my family, and save the rest for my children go to school. I would pay off my student loans and travel personally. Jess said, purchase my neighborhood and my parents travel with my kids. That's awesome. Retire and travel. Make sure all bills are paid and then travel. Put money back for kids' college. Bills, build a building for homeless. Too many things to list, right? Help the needy. Invest in a building and commune. Food sovereignty. Yay. Start my own battered women's and men's shelter and put up money for my children. That's a lot of great ways. I can see like why you're all in this line of work. Everybody's like helping others and food sovereignty and homelessness. So I love that. You guys all have amazing hearts. I wish I had the money to travel and set up my kids too for college and pay off my student loan. Yeah, so goals, right? All right. So before we get going, I want to just remind us to take a look at some of the teachings we had in the past about the characteristics of white supremacy culture. Next slide, Deb. And just a reminder, I don't know if these are helpful. For me, they are, because like I said before, I have always this sense of urgency. I love the half hour before we jump on. I feel like it's time for us to settle in, breathe, prepare, and I think we open the meetings without that sense of urgency. And so I hope everybody else kind of is seeing some of these in our work, or how we're kind of sharing space. And then the other one for me is that perfectionism. I tend to shut down, or, like when I feel like things aren't going as planned. Those are things I'm working on. And that we encourage you all to kind of take a look at. And that's why we start with this slide every time, is just to give you a reminder to interrupt those habits and breathe. All right. So, and then again, that next slide, please, Deb. Thank you. To remember that we are bias support for anyone who experiences violence. Be an advocate as a way of being in the world. So that means we're willing to challenge those harmful practices and the oppression, and etc. And always advocates meet folks where they are at. So it's not about us or how we feel like the system or policy. It's always about meeting them where they're at and letting them make those decisions and informing them and help and knowing, our systems, and providing that information to the survivor, to help them to help ease them through that process, and so that they can make their own decisions. So again, we stand outside the systems, and so although we are embedded in many of those systems, as an advocate, we also will be removing those barriers and acknowledging those overlapping pathways. Advocates carry the collective experience of survivors to make changes at every level. So using those stories in a good way, and honoring those experiences, and as a way to make change. And also, advocacy is grassroots, intersectional, and includes a vision of ending sexual violence through societal and systematic change. So those are really two important reminders that we like to just set the tone. But with that, I really appreciate you all being here and your time, and I'm going to hand it over to Morgan. Thank you, Morgan.
Thanks, Steph. I just wanted to take a minute. I thought I might have seen a hand raised.
Oh,
If
I'm sorry.
somebody had a question and you want to unmute, please go ahead and do that now before we get started.
Thank you, Morgan. I didn't even see that.
Oh no, that's okay, Steph. I think it might have been Shiloh.
That was by accident. Sorry.
Okay, I just wanted to double check before we got started so you didn't think that we missed it. So, okay. If anyone does have questions, though, please feel free to raise your hand or drop it in the chat. I know that Steph will probably check over there if there's anything. So, thanks. Okay, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're all at. I'm Morgan Hawes. I'm the National CTA Sex Trafficking Program Coordinator here at NUSAC. And in my language, we say hili hili hali hama'am. So hello, and I hope you all are well. I come to you today with deep gratitude for this opportunity to speak with you about sex trafficking, and just to have this shared connection together. And some of you might have been at the other trainings or modules for the 40-hour that I presented on. So if so, I'm happy to see you all back and to engage in conversation today together. And if we can just take a moment to center and ground ourselves as we come together in a good way, to take a deep breath and set our intentions for the session, that this is a space for us to connect and engage with empathy and compassion for each other. We are co-learning here, so I'm sure that through the chats, I'll learn just as much from you all as you will learn from this session. And I just wanted to remind us all that this space, that the words that we speak here, the way we express ourselves, that they carry meaning. And so if you're feeling activated, please feel free to take a break. Take that time away for yourself, get a drink of water, whatever you need. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. All right, so for today, our goal is to provide a basic understanding of the systems of trafficking as a form of violence against Native women. So really a basic framework, right, for understanding trafficking as a system. And also for the purposes of the module, we will be focusing on sex trafficking. While we also acknowledge that sex trafficking doesn't exist in a bubble, right? So there can be multiple forms of violence occurring. And this could include things like labor trafficking, even organ trafficking, and other types of exploitation, while someone is also experiencing trafficking. So our objectives collectively will be to define sex trafficking as gender-based violence, to provide guidance on trauma-informed language when we're working with and talking with survivors of trafficking, to recognize that sex trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? And that it targets women, children, also men and boys, and vulnerable persons in general for profit. To identify the warning signs and outreach strategies that we might utilize when we are working with survivors of trafficking, and to identify our services, right, and advocacy strategies. That's why we're here. So what do we mean when we talk about trafficking as a multi-billion-dollar industry? Well, trafficking yields about $150 billion in annual profits. And in the oppression module, some of you might remember that we talked a little bit, right, about these intersections of capitalism and patriarchy and accumulation by dispossession, right? So where some folks are taking away from others to accumulate for themselves. And part of what we discussed is how colonization and imperialism led to, right, things like the forcible removal of our lands, and not just lands, but resources to be taken, right, as commodities. And we discussed how people are also resources and used for labor, right, for example, and that people can also reproduce the next generation, right, of folks who may be used exploitatively. So unlike other commodities that can be consumed, so when we're thinking about other commodities that can be consumed, for example, you might think of things in terms of like illegal commodities, guns or drugs, for example. And these are really considered, well, we can expend these commodities, right? So once they're used, they can't be used again. So consumption, I guess you would say, by one person really prevents another person from consuming it. But human beings are different. Human beings can be resold over and over again, creating in essence sort of unlimited opportunities really for profit. And victims of trafficking are highly expendable, reusable, and very profitable. So what we know is that looking at this sort of structure, right, of basic supply and demand, that when there's a demand, there will also be a desire to fulfill that, right? Because people are motivated here in this scenario by money and power and profits. And so trafficking continues because money is power. And we are going to see that both of these things are at play as we move through this presentation today. Thanks, Deb. So my sort of question for the group, we have a couple here, but thinking about overall, like, what do we know about sex trafficking, right? Like, how and where does it happen? Who is involved? What does it look like? And how does it impact the community? So we have a couple of questions here, and if folks want to drop their responses or answers in the chat, that'd be great. One of the things is, who are you currently seeing in your work? And what are you hearing about trafficking in your communities? So I'll give everyone a few minutes to think and respond, and then we'll share some of those back with the group.
Morgan, when I was working direct services for Indigenous human trafficking survivors, I noticed a lot of involvement with the child protective system in custody or their
Thank you,
family
Shayla.
with.
So like child welfare involvement.
And then targeting LGBTQ plus Two-Spirit youth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Shayla. And someone says, I see what I suspect is students being groomed. Yep, okay. A lot of folks get caught up in addiction, intersections with addictions in our communities. Okay, so familial, yep. Gaming or casino involvement. Thank you, Brittany. Okay, high school sextortion. Okay, yep. Thank you, June. I hear about someone in our community trafficking from their home. Yep. Yeah, teenagers being groomed. Jess says we are on high alert in our community and constantly talking about trafficking because we are near a homeless encampment. Yes, this is an area that we have been exploring at MUSAC. Yes, absolutely. So folks are also reiterating some of these responses. In the local unhoused community, there's trafficking, specifically in the camps. Typically, younger male and females are trafficked and pimped out by drug dealers. Yep, folks in Reno with addiction and team homelessness. Yep, casinos, hotels off of a major highway. Chicago is a hub for sex trafficking, so we have frequent hotspots looking for relatives who may be in the city, and often they're from the res when we find them and have a hard time navigating or finding people to trust. Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Absolutely. So some of the things I had written in the slides too were exactly what you guys talked about. So thank you for bringing these forward. So casinos, right? Gaming, familial trafficking, also trafficking by partners, ex-partners, or even trafficking through events, right? Community events, perhaps. So hunting, I've heard of events like powwows, art shows. I think that we know too, in terms of like man camps, rallies, like bike rallies, truck stops and such like that too. Yes, thank you, Jim. Exactly. Bakersfield is a hub. We're 4 hours from Vegas and 4.5 hours from the southern border. Exactly. So regionally, there are sort of patterns and trends that have developed or ways, right, that we're seeing this manifest itself in our community. Yeah, thanks, Steph. So Steph says in South Dakota, little border towns during outer season or during biker rallies and hunting. Yeah, absolutely. And so we know that just like victims and survivors can be anyone, harm doers or traffickers can also be anyone as well, right? And they're looking at these situations as an opportunity to be exploitive. So what we're seeing, what we understand, what we hear from other folks, it all plays a role, right, in our advocacy work, especially when we're doing outreach and education to individuals and communities about how to identify and address trafficking. And some people may not identify or understand that the situation they are in, or maybe exposed to, is in fact trafficking situation. So we'll talk a little bit about some examples of each tactic, right? So we have force, fraud, and coercion. And force, we would say, physical danger, injury, threat, like being threatened with weapons, kidnapping, threatening violence against family, relatives, loved ones, physical injury, things like being threatened with sexual assault, or even things like situations where people have debt and threats that might have to do with sort of economic reasons. Coercion, right, is, so we're sort of defining this synonymously with manipulation, for example. So controlling what people do, their movements, their sleep, perhaps even those patterns of being, threats of homelessness, controlling what people eat or drink, threats of CPS involvement, threatening to out someone to the community, or threatening law enforcement involvement. Grooming tactics, which you guys have all shared. So thank you. That's such a good, important point. We might also be forced to constantly check in with the trafficker. Constant watching and supervision may be a part of that. Forced abortions. So when we talk about intersections with reproductive justice, right, not being able to make decisions with sort of that freedom of choice over governing our own bodies. Not being allowed to go to the doctor. Forced pregnancies could be the other part of that, right? Moving survivor to different geographic locations, right, where they don't know anyone, or constant and frequent movement of residences. And then when we talk about fraud, we're thinking about sort of lying, deception, which could include like fake, well, I think fake in the sense of like fake opportunity for employment, perhaps, or saying that, if you do this, you'll have this much money, which really then those wages might be different than somebody expects, or saying, okay, I have this housing available, maybe that's not the case. So anything where there's like deceiving the victim or survivor, lying about where someone might be taking the victim or survivor, also saying that something will only just happen this one time to get somebody to do it, because we know that sometimes that's sort of the ploy, right? It's just this one time. We really, really need this A, B, and C, this thing, and if you do it, we'll be able to afford it. We'll be able to, find whatever this is, and then also lying about being in a relationship. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that specifically, what that scenario entails a little bit later on. Deb, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So now we're going to turn our attention to sex trafficking terminology. And it's really important to talk about terminology because some of the words that we use them interchangeably. And you'll probably notice that throughout our conversation today. So when we say sex work, we're defining that as exchanging sex for food, money, housing, transportation, safety, visitation, drugs, or other favors, right? So we can see, here that we're really looking at things of value, right? So even necessities can be considered something of value. When we're talking about sexual exploitation, we are really talking about sex work when there is, in fact, exploitation, right? So sexual exploitation is what happens to someone who is sold, traded, objectified for sex in exchange for something of value. And that could be, again, like we talked about already, money, food, clothing, shelter, safety, drugs, etc., right? Anything of value to that person. So when we're thinking about sex exploitation, the difference here is that something is happening, right? It's exploitive. There's not even the illusion really of consent. and it's an absence of consent or choice, or even just that perception of what could be considered a choice. And when we're thinking about sex trafficking and how we define that, we're saying that sex trafficking occurs when a person is forced or coerced, like we just talked about, what that looks like, into the commercial sex trade against their will, with a third party benefiting from this dynamic. So what does that mean? Well, let's think about that a little bit more. So this is an important distinction, right, in the language. So it's important, especially because when we look at jurisdiction or laws and how we define trafficking, right, that might then be related directly to pursual of charges. But trafficking really requires three parties. That's going to be the victim, the buyer, and the trafficker. And we have to have all three components present. And that presence of the third party who benefits from this exploitation, this is what makes the scenario trafficking. That's how we're defining it. And we know, realistically in the work that we do, that sometimes there are intersections and that it can be really challenging to figure out, right? Like, what is trafficking? How does this apply, these definitions, for example? Because things don't always fit. They might not be cut and dry. And someone can be experiencing, as we mentioned already, multiple forms of violence can be co-occurring. So we're going to look a little bit more at this language in the next slide, if you will, please. Thank you. All right, so we've got this slide here, and I like that there's some overlap on how we're sort of looking at these terms. But I think it's important to remember, right, in terms of advocacy, that our job is really to meet the victim or survivor where they're at. And that means mirroring or adopting the terminology that they use themselves. This really helps us better communicate, and also we shouldn't really, make assumptions about what people understand or how they're sort of defining their experience, right? And this slide really sort of looks at sexual exploitation as an umbrella. So this is really sort of demonstrating the ways in which sexual exploitation can or may occur. So we're looking at commercial sexual exploitation, right? So we have here that it's parenthetically, we're talking about prostitution. We're talking about working, receiving something of value, but there is still exploitation happening within that dynamic. So someone could be working in a club or on the street, but the work is still sex, right? And when we're looking at survival sex, so a sex act for something of value, again, could be money, food, shelter, drugs, etc. This is something, that we have talked a lot about at Muzak, and Shayla, you can jump in at any point if you have something you want to add. But we have heard people say, right, that they're treating sex for necessities or to get basic needs met, whether that's the individual needs of the victim or survivor, or perhaps their children or their families. And, so someone may choose to engage in this act, and it could be for reasons related to those sort of those needs, right? Economically, especially with the inflation and the housing crisis and all the things that we have going on right now in our country. People might be engaging in an act for a place to stay for the night, for example, right? But if you look at this in terms of exploitation, I think the emphasis really is on the buyer and their role, and the trafficker as well, right? Because the person who is asking for this to occur could also just say, you know what, you can stay here. You can crash on my couch, or you can sleep in this extra, spare room for the night, and provide that for free as a good human being, right? Or a good relative. But the exploit part is that there's something here that's opportunistic that somebody is leaning into, and they're saying, I can get something out of this situation, that this person has a vulnerability, and I'm going to take advantage of that. And so that's the part that becomes exploitation. And I think that, there's also this sort of this pivot that occurs, right, where we might have these boundaries as individuals and we say like, I wouldn't do this thing, or, it's easy to sort of like have that judgment that like, if you haven't been in a certain situation or scenarios, you might not do something. And there's sort of what we might think to have a hard line, but if it's possible, right, that anyone could end up in a situation where they might not have enough money for something, or they might not be able to have a need met, and then that becomes a little bit blurry. And once you do something the first time, sometimes it gets a little bit easier after that to justify to yourself or to engage in that action again if you continue to have a need that needs to be fulfilled. And I see a couple comments here, so I just want to pause for a second so we can validate what's happening in the chat here. Yeah, someone's saying that traffickers will watch for females in vehicles and parking lots and write on the back of the window of vehicles with the number of females and children so that they knew how many there were. Wow, okay. And Debbie's saying that during COVID, many partners were pressured to have sex to pay their family's rent and food. Yeah, thanks for saying that, Debbie. I think that what we know from the very limited research and statistics that's available is that during COVID, we saw increases in various forms of violence, and that a lot of folks were experiencing higher levels, right, of poverty and issues being able to sort of meet basic needs. And unfortunately, I believe that, realistically, from the work that we all do, that we know that has continued, especially like I said earlier, with inflation and the way that our economy is sort of unsettled after the pandemic. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And if anyone else has things that they want to share, feel free to use the chat again. Okay, sorry about that. I wanted to make sure we got everything. Okay. So okay, I know where I am now. Sorry about that. So this is sort of difficult, right, to unpack. And it's important that we think about the language again, and that we don't label people, right, people that we are providing services to. And it really sort of focuses on our ability to reflect and being able to understand our own biases. And we want to really, be victim centered, but think intentionally too about relationship building and trust, truth, trust, and transparency, because we know that what might seem like a choice one day could end up not being a choice the next day. It could be that the next time that somebody decides, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. And that might be where we have an interaction with them, right? So part of the work that we might do then is to sort of think a bit about consent. We've talked about that in other modules. We've mentioned it, we've covered it a little bit, but also recognizing that consent can be withdrawn at any time. And what does that look like? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a little while also. So the next sort of square here that we have is stripping pornography, transactional sex work. So when we think of sort of conscious ideas about things like legal sex work, for example, the Bunny Ranch in Nevada, right, where people are working, but it is legal. And within the umbrella of exploitation, though, when we're thinking about things, for example, like pornography or stripping, it's, considering also the age, right? And if they are of age and this is a job that they are doing, they could also still be experiencing pressure or exploitation and being asked to do things that they might not see as that wouldn't be considered part of their job, that they would not agree to under any circumstances, and then they might be pressured under certain circumstances. And with pornography, for example, someone might consent to participate in certain acts or have expectations or negotiated certain work that they're willing to do, and then something might occur unbeknownst to them on site, or again without their consent, right? And what, it can be exploitive. Again, we need you to do this. This is part of your job. You're a professional, and sorry that we didn't tell you about it, but you're gonna have to roll with it. What does
Morgan,
that mean?
Morgan, I was also thinking of like the overlaps of domestic violence too, the exploitation piece and the I think it's commonly referred to as like revenge porn or filming without your
Mhm.
knowledge and exploiting that, but also manipulating the loving relationship, the intimate relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up, Shayla. I think that social media has such a just it's unbelievable the impact, right, that having social media in our lives has had, particularly on youth, but also on just like the ways that people are being exploited. And I think that's so important to sort of voice and bring up. So thank you for saying that too. And we'll talk also about how different forms of violence are connected when it comes to trafficking, but that's an amazing, perfect example. So thank you so much. And I think also, one thing to think about too is that when we reflect back on the definitions we have learned, we can see that the intersections that there's these parallels, right, that exist. And when we're talking about prostitution, trafficking, sex work, and exploitation, and that there's really no one way to define a survivor's experience. So these experiences are complex and multifaceted, and it's important that the ways we understand and support survivors incorporate respect for this continuum of trauma and also the different types of experiences that they have. And sexual exploitation can occur, right? And what we're seeing in any line of work or in any of these categories. Can we go to the next slide? So we won't spend too much time on this, but we're looking here at sex trafficking law, right? And there's a lot of laws, and I mean, they're constantly evolving. The landscape's constantly evolving. Policy, things are changing and shifting. But this is what we sort of landed on for this slide, is just sharing with you the U.S. federal law, right, which is that recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age, right? So they're minor. And then we have an example of Minnesota law, because that's where we're based out of. And the Minnesota law focuses on the actions of the trafficker. So if he or she received, recruited, enticed, harbored, provided, or obtained by any means an individual to aid in prostitution, then sex trafficking has occurred. And proof of force, fraud, or coercion is not required for anyone under the age of 18. And so I think that there's this stereotypical image, right, that many people might have in their heads about a woman who is being held in chains in the back of a cargo van. And we know through our work that that is not the reality of how trafficking happens in most situations or most cases. A person might find themselves in a situation where they feel, that they need to meet basic needs, or could just be a random occurrence, but where they happen to meet someone who's really preying on their vulnerabilities. And the exploiters often can offer emotional or material security initially. And the shame of this situation, plus deep-seated feelings, perhaps that someone feels like, do I question self-worth? Like, do I deserve to be treated poorly? Maybe I've got somehow managed to get myself in this situation. Or based on past or prior traumas, maybe there's normalization of violence. If someone perhaps even maybe grew up in a situation where violence occurred, then these could be risk factors, right? That traffickers are going to use or can use to their advantage to keep folks trapped without having to actually use chains. And yes, thank you, Debbie. Again, right, bringing forward that this can be also family members who are perpetrating or causing harm in these situations. Can we go to the next slide? Sorry, I have a dry throat today, everyone. A little scratchy. Okay, so this slide, we don't have to spend too much time on it, but just wanted to provide you all with an example of tribal trafficking codes. So if you want more information or resources, or you want to look at the sort of trafficking codes in your particular tribe or community, TLPI is a great resource for that. You can sort of see what tribes are doing with federal and state level. And this is just, again, one example, but we figured that the guidance could be helpful. And I think that you all will receive the PowerPoints. You can look this over a little bit more closely. We've also included the link that TLPI has on existing codes here. But we'll just go over this briefly. So, you know, an example here is that a person is guilty of sex trafficking when they are knowingly involved in the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. And again, okay, so very similar to what we saw on the previous page with federal. And the buying or selling of children for any reason. So again, we talked about that, anyone who's a minor under age of 18. And then we see sort of the penalties, right, in category C here. Okay, Deb, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. All right, so we're gonna have another discussion point here, but I'm gonna talk for a second first. So trafficking impacts our Indigenous people across their lifespan, right? And across various demographics, and there's no single identity, story, or experience. It happens on and off tribal lands at the hands of both native and non-native traffickers. Trafficking happens, like Deb has said in the chat, within families, and it is more common than people might think. And oftentimes we hear people say that traffickers are strangers, right? But we know that that's not always the case. Again, sometimes they're well known. They could be a family member, a friend, or a close acquaintance, someone that a person believes that they can trust. And trafficking survivors and traffickers can range, right? From small to big, doesn't have to be like this large, burly man. Oftentimes, someone can be recruited by a woman, perhaps. Like, I mean, that can happen. We know that. And that folks who are trafficked can have various identities. And trafficking can be associated sometimes with gangs or trafficking rings, can be exacerbated by or initiated online or through other digital means of communication. And it can exist at international levels or domestic. So some people, I've had conversations with folks on airplanes where they had no idea that this happened in the US. And we talked a little bit earlier about how trafficking can also include labor, not just sex trafficking. And that it can happen to anyone, right? There might be some common vulnerabilities that increase sort of perhaps opportunities to exist where traffickers can exploit and take advantage of victims or survivors. So maybe things like childhood traumas, like sexual abuse or incest, being a member of a marginalized population, again, with historic oppression, things we talked about in our oppression module, right? Like systemic inequalities, intergenerational trauma, invisibility, folks who have substance use disorders, right? People who are struggling with mental health or who have disabilities also. Those can be risk factors. And so we know that, you know, thinking about also things like lack of support systems. So some, like, I think we already heard about earlier, systems involved, maybe even something like lack of health care. And then Shayla mentioned too, right? Intersections with domestic violence, sexual assault. Those who suffer the effects of violence could be at increased risk of trafficking, homelessness and housing insecurity. So not having stable housing where folks are maybe engaging again in survival sex. And also we know with other economic issues like food scarcity or people feeling like they're, in a position where they have an inability to be able to make ends meet and provide for their children, may be seeking some form of financial security that may sort of leave them vulnerable to situations occurring that might have been outside of what they expected, right? And yes, thank you, Carrie. Parents too, trafficking children for drugs, money, or status. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That does occur, right? Especially when we're talking about familial trafficking. And so it's really important to think about this issue systemically, right? Meaning that we're understanding how all of these factors add up in an individual's life to increase vulnerability and exploitation. And these are factors that can be traced back to root causes, and they're not based on an individual's poor choices or bad lifestyles or any of that, right? An individual didn't create these issues for themselves. So knowing that, I'm wondering if you all have some thoughts or experiences you want to share, or examples of force in trafficking, fraud, or coercion. These three things that we talked about that really sort of make up the basis of how we define trafficking. And feel free to, again, use the chat.
I was thinking of another scenario, even friends trafficking friends under and over the age of 18 or recruiting.
Yeah, thank you, Shayla, for bringing that up. Absolutely. I think we see too, right? Like intersections, I think also with social media, when we're talking about that, we can possibly see that with youth too. Okay, I can leave the chat open. So if anyone has anything they want to share, feel free to drop it in as we move along. Oh, okay. Lori has something. I learned trauma is the gateway to a lot of negative situations. Yeah, I think that absolutely we're seeing that there's an intersection right here. There's some overlap between past or other like current traumas that are occurring and trafficking. There's extortion and coercion, sex trafficking in the prison systems. Yes, thank you so much, Carrie. Someone brought that to my attention, and we had a conversation a couple months ago about how traffickers maintain relationships while victim survivors are incarcerated. There's a lot to unpack there, but yeah, that was something that was sort of brought up, is that they might add money to commissary accounts, or sort of almost like that I still have this way of getting in touch with you, right? Like and then still like reestablishing that relationship of like, oh, well, I care about you. Or even when somebody gets out, right, who has been justice impacted, gets out of being in sort of the prison system, they might say something like, well, you owe me because I put this money on your account, and how are you going to pay that back? That sort of thing. We've had some conversations about that. Yeah. Deb, do you want to go to the next slide? If anyone wants to add anything in the chat, please feel free. Okay, so we've sort of already talked about this, right, in our discussion today, but some of the dynamics of sex trafficking might include things, right? We're looking here at appeasement versus consent. So I'm doing this because I have to, or doing this because I want to. So when we look at appeasement, we're seeing decisions made under duress, right? Versus being given multiple viable options to choose from. And recognizing at the same time that someone might not really know what consent looks like, or feels like, or they might never have had an opportunity in their lives to practice consent, depending on their past experiences. So, I mean, for example, if someone's saying to you, okay, yeah, I can provide you with a place to crash tonight, a place to sleep, or I guess you can sleep on the street. So you can stay here with me and you're going to do this thing, or you're going to sleep outside. Like, is that really giving somebody a viable option? It's not, right? It's not really consent because this decision is being made under duress. So that's just an example. It's sort of that illusion of choice, right? The consent doesn't really exist. But the person who's benefiting is the person who's providing the ultimatum, right? So you're being given these two options: do what I say or face the consequences, versus focuses on the benefit and the agency, right? Freedom to make the choice. And then we have, again, the person who is enforcing the choice is the one who's benefiting, versus there being a safe environment to think about the choices or options that are viable in that situation. So sometimes traffickers will show affection or provide the victim or survivor with necessities, right, to demonstrate that they care. Like we talked about, the commissary accounts for folks who are currently in the prison system. And then the victim or survivor may believe that the person does care, or feel that they owe them, or they might think if the person does care about them, that that's sort of the illusion of choice too, that they're being offered a decision, even though we know that this is actually coercion by manipulation, right? They're being manipulated. And then there are consequences that when people are, using this sort of appeasement dynamic, that are harshly enforced. What that looks like, right, really depends on the situation: physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological, versus when there's consent. Consequences are a natural part, right, of life, and don't usually involve that sort of physical or threats of violence. And some of the work that we do is important, and because it allows us to sort of think about empowerment and opening up a space to talk about that consent aspect and what it looks like. And was there a safe space to make these decisions? Did I really have those viable options? And part of what we had talked about previously and some of the other modules too was, am I in the state to consent? Was I in a state? If we've talked about the multiple reasons that people might be vulnerable, one of them being addiction or having a substance use disorder. So if somebody's in that state, are they really able to consent? Oh, and we have something else in the chat here. Let me see. It says people not knowing how to manage feelings around having been traumatized. So those individuals really seeking healing, but get into vulnerable situations. Yeah, absolutely, right? And if people have certain vulnerabilities, what does consent look like for them? Great, thank you. Deb, will you go to the next slide? Thanks, Deb. Is it just me, or is there a giant yellow line on there? Okay, I have no idea what that is. Okay.
Yeah, somebody
strange.
highlighted it, and I don't know how to take it off now.
We're trying
Sorry,
to
y'all.
troubleshoot in the background, but we can't figure it out.
I just looked at it and I thought to myself, did somebody do some coloring on this slide? But okay. I wasn't sure what was happening. That threw me off for a second. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I think we're trying to clear it off, but I'm not seeing that.
Lori is asking a question about sound. Are you able to hear now, Lori? Are you okay? Do you need any tech support?
I can hear you now, just this moment. Thank you.
Okay, great. Just checking. Okay, so here we're looking at the ecosystem of sex trafficking, right? So we can see that the ecosystem really sort of is representing this loop where there's a demand for these services brought to light by the relationship between the buyer and the trafficker. And so it's really kind of like a business relationship because that's the reality of how this functions, right? Profit, commodities, people as commodities. And we have to really focus on all three to understand this ecosystem and address all the factors in the work that we do. So, not just looking at the victim and the trafficker, but also the buyer. And how do we hold buyers responsible or accountable for their part in this process? And as long as, oops, I just went to the wrong side on my own thing. And as long as there's a demand, someone's going to try to meet it, right? We talked about this really early on, but it's about profit, it's about money, it's about power. And we might be talking about people, but somebody's benefiting. And we were talking about pornography earlier, and sort of this is an interesting thing to me, but I've had a lot of conversations lately with some younger folks who have talked about their sort of them engaging in OnlyFans. I'm not sure how many of you guys are sort of familiar with that and just all of the things. But I know I've heard people sort of jokingly make comments about selling their feet and that kind of stuff. But I also know of folks who do engage in this work online. And what we're seeing, right, is this trend that there's a demand. And so there will be a supply to respond to that. And as that, sort of exists, this is sort of a business venture, if you will, where we're not really exhausting what's being sold, right? Like pictures or these acts that are occurring that might be videotaped or cataloged online. Like these things can happen repeatedly over and over again, and there's a profit to be had from them. And like we talked about already, doing something one time may make people feel more comfortable or less fearful of doing it again, or make people feel like, okay, I did it once, so it wasn't too bad, or what have you. And so there's sort of that, I think, that narrative that can occur that someone sort of uses to maybe continue to sort of justify like those decisions that are happening, whether those decisions are their own or not. We talked about with consent. And this is where education and community outreach, right, can be really important for us, especially with youth, and understanding like how, how these sort of risk factors like are intersecting, and what those vulnerabilities look like. And even with things that are happening on social media, there's a lot of conversation that's occurring, a lot of things that are happening. I know with my own kids, I'm constantly monitoring their social media because I've had my little ones say, "Oh, I'm playing Minecraft," and I'm like, didn't realize they can actually talk to people on this Minecraft. I thought it was just like little blocks and Legos. And my older son, who's much older than the youngest, they're 12 years apart, was like, "No, mom, I think that they can just like people on there." Of course, I don't know anything about video games, so I feel like there's just constant opportunities here for education, even for me. I'm always learning something, and it kind of, as a parent, makes me fearful. But there's work to be done in the community, especially as we know that some folks might not, parents or community members might not have an understanding of these sort of newer and more advanced technological ways that people are connecting online. Deb, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay, this one's been colored on too. All right. So we have the Garden of Truth report here, which is the seminal study that was published in 2010. And the goal of this study was to assess the life circumstances of Native women who are engaging in prostitution in the state of Minnesota. So really sort of thinking about highlighting their experiences and needs and the extent to which those needs were or were not being met. And we know that prostituted women were extremely high risk for violence and emotional trauma. So we interviewed 105 women in prostitution and administered 4 questionnaires that asked about like family history, sexual and physical violence throughout their lifetimes, homelessness, symptoms of PTSD and dissociation, use of available services like domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, rape crisis centers, and substance use treatment. And we asked women about the extent to which they were connected with their cultures and if that helped them or not. So 79% have been abused as children, with an average of 4 perpetrators. 2/3 of the women had family who attended boarding schools. 92% had been raped. 84% had experienced physical assault. 72% reported that they had experienced a TBI in prostitution. 98% were either currently or previously homeless. 52% had PTSD. 71% had symptoms of dissociation. 80% had used outpatient substance use services. 77% had used homeless shelters. 65% had used domestic violence shelters, and 33% had used sexual assault services. And 92% of the women that were surveyed had wanted to escape prostitution. So what we can understand from this study is that Native women are exceptionally vulnerable to high rates of poverty, homelessness, and sexual violence, all of which are elements that impact risk of trafficking for Native women. And I'll share a little bit more information too about sort of like other general sex trafficking statistics, but the general consensus is that American Indian and Alaska Native people are being trafficked at disproportionately higher rates compared to other race ethnicities. And although there's limited research and statistics available that are current, evidence of trafficking has existed since contact and colonization, right? And Indigenous people, while we make up less than 10% of the population, over 40% of people being trafficked were Indigenous. And 70% of the violence committed against Native women was perpetrated by non-Native individuals. So what we also saw too, I'll go back to this just to highlight it, was that in the study, you know, about half of the women met the legal definition for sex trafficking. So although out of the 105 women, like, you know, being sort of like engaging in the survey and being involved in like the questionnaires and such in the study, you know, if you think about it, like half of the women, so whether or not they defined themselves as engaging in prostitution or being a victim or survivor of sex trafficking, that's sort of what came out, right? It's sort of interesting because we talked about that connection to the language component earlier in the presentation and really meeting the people that we are providing services to where they're at, but also recognizing perhaps that they do meet the definition, right? That includes that coercion, force, fraud, exploitation, and those different sort of dynamics that we've discussed today. And the part, you know, what we also had emphasized about third-party control is really like where that sort of evidence came from, right? Linking it to sex trafficking instead of prostitution specifically. Oh, I think Tyrell's asking a question here. Do you have data that compares sex trafficking versus labor trafficking? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Not for the purposes of the study, Tyrell, but I would love to connect if you, you know, Steph can share my email, but I think that's like part of some of the work that I've been seeing done and discussed is like, how do we really explore like the intersections, but also, you know, people who are sex trafficked could also be victims of labor trafficking as well. So it's not necessarily either or, but they're just recognizing they can coexist is one of the things that I've been seeing and sort of thinking a lot about in different spaces, like attending conferences and symposiums and whatnot. But yeah, I think
that's something actually kind of vice versa that I have seen a little bit of data on, is the people who are labor trafficked then being sex trafficked.
Something to be proud of for sure.
yeah.
What were you saying about that guy?
Yeah, I agree with that. I was at a symposium in January, and it said it's sort of like, umbrellaed under human trafficking, but really the specifics were more focused on labor trafficking, which was very interesting. And I could see how also, like, traffickers might utilize like some of those strategies. So that part felt really important, but also it was a good space to like start a conversation with folks too about how, like I said, like these may coexist. What does that look like? And in terms of exploitation, like you can imagine that traffickers, right? Like all of this is labor trafficking, sex trafficking. This is about profit. And that if there's multiple ways to traffic an individual, like then that's probably something that will be explored. So I think that that is a really sort of interesting point and distinction to make. But I think as far as data, like what we've known is that there's a need. There is really a need to have current updated research and statistics, but also thinking intentionally, at least for me, I think about this a lot, is like, how do we also really share space with like incorporating storytelling and recognizing that, numbers are important, but they're numbers, and that they're individuals and human beings that are having these experiences, and like, where do we also share that part and really bring that forth, and not in an exploitive way where we're sort of using people's stories, but where we are thinking really intentionally about what this data represents, and how we are also extrapolating it. But yeah, like I said, feel free to reach out to me. I could talk about data all day. I love that. Deb, do you want to go to the next slide, please? Okay, thank you. So trafficking and other forms of violence. So we've already done a little bit of background on this, like talking about how there are intersections with what Shayla mentioned too, right? Domestic violence and all of the things. So trafficking, we're saying here, is linked to other forms of violence. So very, very directly, we can't understand trafficking without understanding the intersections to, child sexual abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, or other forms of violence, right? Like we're even thinking of like elder abuse and such. Trafficking is intersectional, and it intersects with these multiple and different forms of violence. And these experiences can be current, or they can be past traumas. So when we have someone that we're working with that comes to us, just thinking about talking about, they might come and they might be talking about something else, right? They might be talking about a sexual assault, they might be talking about a stalking situation, but we also might identify for ourselves in the work that we're doing that there's trafficking that's occurring. So we have a question here for you all, a chat question, but can you think of anything else, right? What else? What other types, other forms of violence do you imagine or have you seen intersecting with trafficking in the work that you do? And again, feel free to use the chat, or if you want to come off mute, that's okay too.
Morgan, this is Becky. We would often see trafficking intersecting even with like serious property crime or theft, or like those other types of crimes as well, drugs, weapons, right? Like those
Mhm.
kinds of things outside of like personal violence.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah, absolutely. And someone's saying, Jennifer's saying forced criminalization. Yep. Yep, absolutely. Coaches for spots on teams. Yep. And when we say violence too, right? We don't have to mean, like Becky was saying too, like we're not limited in the capacity to identify violence as just physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological, right? And how that manifests itself could differ. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I wonder,
Getting
like,
those lesser.
like you, like how you said, other forms of violence, like oppression and racism, and understanding the vulnerability, and I was also even thinking of like abuses of power, folks who work for the for programs who are designed for public safety, like police,
Mhm.
courts, school systems.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Shayla. Absolutely. It was funny that you say like sort of like some of that is like made me think of systemic, right? And structural. And like when you were talking about the oppression and the racism too, like those power plays, right? Um, because you imagine that like that's how what we're internalizing, right? And carrying with us is like those impacts too. We're going to talk a little bit about impact, but yeah, absolutely. Someone's saying gatekeeping and organizing spaces, gambling addictions, like giving them funds to keep gambling, not being able to repay. Oh yeah, absolutely. Carrie says isolating, ignoring, or bullying people in the community with mental health or substance use problems. Yes. Yep. Mental violence. Absolutely. Using access to culture or community to control people. Yeah. Thank you, Janie. That's definitely really important to recognize. Yeah, absolutely. Deb, do you want to go to the next slide? People can keep dropping things in the chat though. Okay, thanks, Deb. Okay, so when we're thinking about grooming tactics, so a bunch of you had mentioned grooming earlier, right? Especially, particularly some folks have mentioned youth, but just grooming strategies in general. So we see sort of sweet talking, full attention, being made to feel special, providing gifts. So those could be phones, clothes, etc. Token acts of kindness, sort of like as redemption sometimes too in that relationship. Like, oh, but I'm so nice. Look, I gave you this thing. Oh, nope, I'm abusive. Oh, nope, I'm nice again. Safe place to stay, right? Again, we talked about that housing component, how crucial that is right now, given the current sort of housing crisis and landscape. True love, it's us against the world, that kind of mentality. Access to alcohol or drugs. Help me pay these bills. I just need help this one time or however many times. You owe me, right? We talked about that in terms of folks who feel like they owe someone because, like we've already mentioned, like whether that's through incarceration or being able to access certain things, like I got you this opportunity, so you owe me, or the gambling, that was a perfect example. Isolation, intimidation, being called crazy, stupid, ugly, etc. So right, really working on somebody's feelings or self-worth. No one else wants you. Well, nobody else wants you. No one knows where you are, right? So like focus on that sort of what we talked about was that geographic movement, right? Frequently relocating, emotional, verbal abuse, threats to people, family, pets, physical violence, sexual violence, being shown pornography and forced to sort of act out the things that are being seen, right?
And then I
Any
was even
addition-
thinking, Morgan, normalizing the exploit or like normalizing this behavior and kind of putting us like manipulating their situation. Like here's a way like you could get your survival needs, or of course not framing it that way, but manipulating maybe their financial or like normalizing it into making them believe it's like kind of a survival tactic or like it's a way.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, Shayla. Absolutely right. So I think that's like one of the things that was just like briefly mentioned was like that folks might have from past experience feel that certain types of like they might have basically been exposed to certain things where it feels like, oh, well, maybe this is normal. I've seen like this type of thing happen before, or I've been exposed to it. It's like almost like the meter of like what's normal, right, is a little bit different. And I think that, yeah, like that sort of they use that as a strategy or a tool, right, to say like, oh no, like this is fine, people do this all the time, or no, because I love you, it's different, it's okay, like it'll, and we're together, it's not the same, and I'm saying it's okay if you do this thing with this other person, so that makes it okay. And like sort of it becomes like the new basis of normal. Yeah, I think that that's a, and like we had already talked about, like you do something once, it's what is it, it's a little bit easier to maybe more palatable the next time, maybe not, but maybe, right? And also I think like in terms of sort of grooming tactics, like a common tactic is to use like peer groups, right, to recruit kids, like we already talked about, you guys were saying, like at schools or in town, community centers, clubs, youth, like recruiting other youth, or through daily activities, like, oh, I have clothing, makeup, these new Air Jordans, spending time with friends, and then things like use of technology, right? Those chat rooms, apps, social media, and like different sort of ways of communicating, whether that's like on the phone, video gaming, like in the example I had, or other sort of electronic devices. And like additional sort of things too, like that people might look out for, like in terms of warning signs, could be just also in terms of like grooming strategies, because we don't have a slide for this in particular, but would be like changes or withdrawals in daily activities, in sexual activities, unexplained money, drugs, clothes, somebody not having access to personal ID or sort of their own money or documents, birth certificates and such, changes in the nature of what people post on social media or online, or where they post, like living in houses where there's frequent traffic, frequent relocation, or people go missing for periods of time, people not, like we've also spoken about this, but people being sort of unable to be by themselves, like they're not on, they're always with someone, they're not unaccompanied, and always checking in or sort of being on the phone with someone. But those are just a few things that I had written down because we didn't have a specific particular slide for that. And then, okay, can you go to the next slide, Deb? I want to make sure you guys get your break. So, okay, talk quickly. We have trauma coerced attachment, right? So like that trauma bond, and it's a powerful psychological manipulation strategy used by traffickers. So victims really think like, okay, this person loves me, we're in love, they care about me. And when that happens, like when that strategy is employed, the trafficker has the upper hand, and it's easier to manipulate the victim because they believe again in that illusion of choice. And it's less work for them, but there's sort of this mental handcuff, right, that exists. And so somebody might look like they might be out in the community, they might look like they're doing okay, like people see them and interact with them, they might go to school, they might go to work, but there can still be abuse and violence happening right behind the scenes, and that can be intermittent and predictable. Abuse and manipulation, you see this in domestic violence situations too, that this is a powerful tactic. You can keep someone controlled, and not, maybe other people are not seeing this. This could be invisible to the outside eye, right? And traffickers are smart, and they are calculated, and they are intentional in their manipulation, and they know how and what strategies work, and they employ them. And Deb, do you want to go to the next one, please? Okay, thanks. So possible impacts and effects, right? We have things like disassociation and fear and distrust, inability to be close to others, the sort of scarlet letter, right? People feel shame, suicidal, internalizing those feelings, and that can really be a struggle. That's a huge struggle, right? Loss of self-worth, which again is what traffickers use to their advantage. If they play on that whole thing we saw with, well, no one else wants you, you're not good enough. Someone feels deserving of being abused or used, difficulties fitting in, isolation, right? Depression, anxiety, phobias, PTSD, feeling like they're being watched because they might be or have been, difficulty concentrating, being seen as damaged goods, like I have all this baggage now, eating difficulties, probably sleeping difficulties, avoidance of spiritual, cultural traditions and communities, and just activation certain triggers, right? And Sarah's saying, yep, the chain effect. Every chain link has a manipulation. It's important to break the chain. Thank you. So we know that these effects can be both short and long term, depending on the individual, their experiences, and their personal healing journey. These are connected to the mind, body, spirit, and our emotions, right? So the impacts of trafficking might include disconnects from, like we've seen, self and family, from culture, those feelings of, right, being unworthy, like I can't participate, I have shame, I carry the shame and blame. Feeling judged might be part of the reason people or fear of being judged too, right? Could avoid sort of spiritual or cultural tradition, trauma, mental health, addiction, and also when we're thinking about sort of like physical impacts too, these can include things like we've talked about already, like TBIs, but also even things like dental issues, chronic health issues related to chronic health conditions, not just the ones that are here, but like some people experience chronic pain, so or stomach aches and bloating, and then of course like things that impact reproductive justice issues, right? Like unwanted pregnancies or forced pregnancies, STDs, STIs, and stuff like that. Yes, thank you, Jennifer. Things like poor nutrition. Yeah, absolutely. Even like cognitive things, right? Like migraines, trouble concentrating, stuff like that too. Deb, will you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so here we're talking about sort of like the reactions and responses that people we work with might be experiencing, right? So we know the fight, flight, and freeze, but also there's a couple more here. So we have fawn and flop. And it's just important for us to really sort of recognize the different responses and reactions that people might have to situations where they're in crisis, and to understand that we really have no control over these situations, right? Like it's important that we know sort of how to recognize where somebody might be to meet them where they're at, like we've already talked about a couple of times, because it will really help us to connect, so that we're not making assumptions about why somebody does or does not do something, but understanding that there are reasons behind what choices or reactions people have. And some of it might be unbeknownst to them too, right? Like the individual might not understand exactly what their activation is or their trigger is, or what's happening. And even when people have been trained to understand how to react or respond to crises, that doesn't mean that they're always going to use those skills. I mean, it really just depends. Some people could end up receiving training, but might panic or could have one of these reactions as well. And so I think that really sort of the takeaway too here is thinking about like, what do we need to provide, or what is needed to be provided? What kind of support can we provide in that moment? Again, from the being victim centered, from the victim or survivor's viewpoint. And if somebody's not ready to exit or to what have you, even to have the conversation, like how do we leave space for them so that when they're safe enough, like they know what resources or services or what's available to them. Deb, will you go to the next slide, please? All right, so signs to look for in the community. So we know, again, we talked about familial trafficking a little bit, right? And we know that also there might be certain locations where people buy sex. So that could be casinos, bars, restaurants, homes, etc. So these are really like sort of places where, you know, I have heard at least where people are like, oh yeah, I knew about that house, like that one house on this street in our community, right? So some folks, they have an awareness even on the community level of these places, spaces and places. Large gatherings also. So we talked about this, but hunting, right? Hunting season, fishing tournaments, sporting events, concerts, powwows. Also noticing if there are unfamiliar people in your community who don't have a reason to be there. Homes with all windows are sort of covered up. Suspicious business fronts. So that could include like massage parlors, nail salons, medical supply stores, stuff like that. And additionally, you know, trafficking happens in cities and small communities. Recruitment can take place in person or through the internet, where traffickers might sort of seek that benefit of anonymity, and in areas with extractive industries near like pipelines, for example, oil, trucking, man camps. We've also seen like an influx in trafficking in those sort of areas and situations as well. Want to go to the next slide, Deb? Okay, so a couple more slides. We're almost done. Interventions. So think about investing in creating highly visible local peer support, right? Being creative with events or activities that could be entry points for intervention or education. Connecting with different organizations. You can see here the list that we have. Building strong collaborations with other social service programs and agencies, but also protecting privacy, confidentiality, including culturally informed, welcoming language and information on materials. So when we're thinking about how we can help survivors of trafficking, thinking about like what they need, right? And we know like commonly requested services might include like crisis intervention, emotional support, safety planning, substance use support, medical care, relocation services, assistance with basic needs, and such like that. So thinking also about like opportunities to restore cultural connections, and helping someone to feel reconnected, right, and accepted as a member of the community. Thinking about access to healing and justice in the way that's defined and pursued by the survivor. Thinking about, again, that safe and affordable housing, and if they have children, what will be necessary for reunification. Economic and medical and other types of support. So really thinking about the survivor and their needs. And then culturally designed, like we're talking about that part of it, like the program. So thinking about like therapy and substance use treatment, mental health treatment, spiritual support services. And also when we talk about interventions, something that we've been doing work on, particularly at MUSAC, is thinking about prevention also. And I know that I think some of the conversations that we've had in these modules has talked a little bit about like that aspect too. So thinking about prevention too, right? In terms of how we respond. Can you go to the next slide, Deb? Sorry, I feel like my throat's giving out on me here. Okay, so advocacy to meet basic needs. So all stuff that you guys are probably all familiar with, you're already working with folks, having these experiences, some of these conversations, doing some of this work, whether that's something that you know or anticipate or not. But really, it's sort of just taking the skills and the tools that you have to continue to do the work. And there are always going to be sort of new things evolving, new ways of thinking and doing the things, and systems change. But really just continuing to learn and share knowledge and space with the communities that you serve, right? And so including things like that culturally competent and informed practices and care, that trust building that we talked about, thinking about school and GEDs, housing, all the things that are needed, right? All of these things, life skills, again, those relocation, all the needs that we just mentioned. Next slide, please, Deb. So we're going to talk about, just right before we wrap up here, like the importance of really thinking about our own biases and our own judgments that we might carry, right? And how we are addressing sex trafficking in our communities through sort of being trauma informed and survivor centered. And really, this is a process where we recognize that violence could be a chronic way of life for some survivors, grounded maybe perhaps in a continuum of traumatic experiences. And so this trauma-informed approach is really based on the recognition that behaviors and responses to these experiences are directly related, right, to the experiences that folks carry across a lifespan. So, being patient, allowing time and trust building, recognizing and validating fears and concerns. So some examples are like prosecution, children being removed from the home, community or family members sort of like finding out about what's occurred, and also sort of thinking about, right, like language, how that's very powerful in the way that we sort of do this work. Instead of saying victim, saying survivor, thinking about that many survivors might not view themselves in this way as victims or survivors even. And this is, something that, we is an opportunity for sort of discussion and intrigue and thought and meeting people where they're at. And also thinking about how we've talked about survivors might not have identified or don't identify that what they have been engaged in or, experiencing is trafficking. So thinking about how we can connect and provide education and let survivors identify themselves. And also recognizing that need again to reconnect with culture, right? So focusing on that action, not on the person in terms of judgment, but what has transpired. And our last slide is change making. So acknowledging invisibility and centering, and involve those who have been targeted, shifting that focus, right, to buyers and perpetrators, and restoring cultural identity, volumes and customs, and hosting community discussions, enhancing and revising policies. And also, it's not on the slide, but decolonizing, right? Because we talked about social change advocacy. That was the module that I presented on. And what we know is that decolonizing is social change. So that means restoring those tribal values and customs. That means sacredness and respect for women and children, sacredness for men as healthy family members, right? Celebrating and respecting differences, valuing child rearing, valuing community, and being a good relative. And that's what I got for today. Only 4 minutes over, Steph.
You're good. Thank you so much, Morgan. There's not any questions. We are going to take our break. So we have a 15-minute break. So we'll be back about, what is that? 2:50? I am not good at mathing 15 minutes.
That's right.
Okay, see everybody back at 2:50. Thank you. 2:50 Central Time. 15 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you're able to take a little break and refill your coffee and whatever you need. We're going to get right into our last module of the day. And I'm really happy that Shayla and Afton are going to be doing this teaching on advocacy for LGBTQ and our Two-Spirit relatives. So with that, we have another poll. And if you want to use chat, if I ever have to have the opportunity to invent something, it's going to be let's see, what would I invent? Wider Pringles so they can fit my hands. Hi, Raul.
Especially the sour cream and onion. Just kidding.
Chip. Oh, I love that. Chip free windshield. I just got a chip in my windshield and then I got out this morning or a couple days ago and it just like turned into this huge thing and I'm like, oh God. Teleportation. Yeah, pocket loudspeaker. I like it. It's funny. All right. Affordable wheelchairs that can go from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I've read two that totally okay. Affordable wheelchairs that can go through a forest or prairie. Okay. Language translator earpiece, like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. There we go. Okay, that makes more sense. A little hover car like the Jetsons had for transportation. Is anybody friends with Lenny Hayes? I saw he was put on his Facebook. They were somewhere for a training and they have the the what do you call it? The remote like taxis or whatever, or not remote, what do you call it? Like the hands-free, there's nobody driving. Oh, yeah, it's interesting. I feel like we're getting to the Jetson stage right now. All right. So with that, thank you, Afton. Afton, I don't, so Shayla, you, if you want to, introduce yourself again, and then Afton, that'd be amazing. I think, Shayla has introduced herself, but I see some new names today. I will hand it over to you, ladies.
Danse Pont Apita Kisigal. Good afternoon. I'm Shayla Beaumont. Yeah, I'm just excited to be all with you all. I'm on my third cup of coffee, so sorry if Afton, do you want to go next?
Hamadak Yapi. My name's Afton. I am the clearinghouse coordinator here at MUSAC, and I've been asked to join along with this, and I'm so excited. Thank you.
And I'm Becky. I'm also just joining in at the last minute with folks, so I will just be here listening in or contributing or whatever is needed. Good to see you all again.
Thank you, Becky.
So today we will be talking about advocacy for our Two-Spirit Native LGBTQ plus survivors and how we could strengthen support for services carried out. Next slide, please, Deb. So today we hope to prepare everyone and volunteers who can provide effective and inclusive advocacy for LGBTQ plus Two-Spirit relatives, becoming familiar with best practices and affirming services, honoring the history for our Two-Spirit relatives in Indian country, discussing the unique barriers to safety, and also identifying effective advocacy strategies. for survivors of sexual violence. We do have a quick video. Are we able to play it?
Yeah, and the video is just about 6 minutes or so. So can you just make sure that you have the captions on too, Deb? And I think this is a really great video because it does a nice job of just talking about our two-spirit relatives and gives like a little bit of history and some information. And so it's a really great introduction. The link is there too, so you can go back and watch it after today. And you may need to share your audio, Deb.
Two-spirit actually mean, and where does it come from? So what is two-spirit? It's an umbrella term that bridges Indigenous and Western understandings of gender and sexuality. You may recognize it as the two that sometimes appears on the end of LGBTQ2. There are many definitions and understandings of two-spirit, and each is nation-specific. The term was intentionally introduced by Native people with the goal of finding common ground and helping educate about traditional teachings in a contemporary context. The Two-Spirit Society of Denver offers the following definition. Two-spirit refers to another gender role believed to be common among most, if not all, First Peoples of Turtle Island, North America, one that had a proper and accepted place within Native societies. This acceptance was rooted in the spiritual teachings that say all life is sacred. So how did the term two-spirit first come about? In 1990, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, at the 3rd annual Native American Gay and Lesbian Gathering, the term two-spirit was proposed and affirmed by consensus. The word was a potential solution to what Native scholars and activists called the problem of naming, or making the many different sexual and gender identities that fall under the two-spirit umbrella legible across Native and non-Native cultures alike. For example, to illustrate the diversity of meanings that two-spirit contains, consider the following. In Lakota, the word winkte means to be as a woman and refers to two-souled Lakota people who transgress boundaries of gender from what may be considered male to female. In Dene, nadlehe means those who transform and refers to one of 4 separate genders: masculine, feminine, masculine, masculine, feminine, masculine, and feminine, feminine. Each gender has its own word in the Dene language. And those are just 2 nation-specific examples. There are so many more. Each nation's understanding of gender and sexual diversity is different and grounded in specific spiritual beliefs. Although all nations don't have a concept of two-spirit people, across those Indigenous nations that do, two-spirit people were historically held in high regard and often considered sacred or divine, holding important positions like matchmakers, medicine people, or warriors on the front lines of battle. Many two-spirit people perform roles traditionally assigned to both men and women. Witwa, a famous two-spirit of the Zuni or Ihumana, was known to take part in masculine tribal matters and feminine tribal matters, and was even sent as an official Zuni delegate to Washington, D.C. Part of the reason two-spirit was adopted at the 1990 conference was because much of the written record on the Indigenous nations of North America begins with European contact. For instance, the writings of Jesuit priests from the 1600s contain references to berdaches, which means kept boy in French, to refer to those who embodied both male and female genders. These writings often focus negatively on perceived cross-dressing among the Anishinaabe. The term is not only inaccurate in that it projects a European understanding of gender, but is widely considered pejorative by natives. Two-spirit was an attempt at self-determination across linguistic barriers, because the existing language, foreign and imposed violently on the Indigenous peoples of North America, was both offensive and deeply colonial in its gaze. European colonizers imposed homophobia, rigid binary gender roles, and misogyny under the guise of civilizing Indigenous people through the Christian tradition in residential schools and beyond. As a result, Indigenous people were robbed not only of their land, but of their spiritual traditions and way of life regarding two-spirit people. Many nations came to forbid and punish two-spirit unions and self-expression. As recently as 2004, Kathy Reynolds and Dawn McKinley, two Cherokee women in Tulsa, Oklahoma, attempted to marry under tribal law, setting off a convoluted legal battle with serious political and social implications. The two were thrust into the spotlight against their wishes and became instant public symbols of the battle for two-spirit rights under tribal law. The Cherokee tribe is the second largest in the US. Although they were granted the right to marry, the decision to issue them a marriage license was soon challenged and led to a tribal law declaring that a union was to be between a man and a woman. Eventually, in 2016, the law was overturned. By that time, a wider cultural shift had taken place, both outside of and within the Cherokee Nation. In recent years, many Native people are returning to their two-spirit traditions as a way to heal from the injustices the American colonial project has visited upon their ancestors and traditions. In 2011, the first known US two-spirit powwow was organized by the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits. Since then, powwows honoring two-spirits have been held in Montana and Kansas. And in March of 2017, the largest powwow in the US, the Gathering of Nations, honored two-spirit people during its grand entry. Two-spirit identity is resilient and precious. It has survived centuries of colonial violence and prejudice. These sacred ways of knowing live on amongst Native youth seeking to know more about themselves, elders who have kept the traditions alive in spite of the odds, and anyone in between. It should go without saying, but two-spirit is not a poetic way for non-Native LGBTQ people to express themselves. We're looking at you, Jason Morales. It is, however, a sacred tradition among the first peoples of this land we call Turtle Island, that all of its inhabitants should know about and respect.
You take the key, but you must first learn the discipline.
Thank you.
Unlock the energy within.
Thank you. And thank you to our interpreters, because we did not give a heads up on that video,
But the
but
label has only been used since the 90s. The concept of the two-spirit.
As a
hopefully,
small business owner, you're juggling the job of 5.
could you mute your screen, Deb?
Yeah, I'm trying to get out of it.
But hopefully,
Okay.
on the video as well. So I appreciate that. I just thought that that would be a really nice way to kind of start us out, because this module does start out with talking about some history about our two-spirit relatives. And so I think that video does a nice job of kind of capturing a lot of, what we wanted to kind of start with today and maybe introduce some of you to, because we all are at different points in our learning, right? And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, whenever we're talking about cultures or populations that we might not be a part of specifically. So I do not identify as two-spirit or part of the LGBTQ community. That we're listening to folks who are in the community, right? We're using their language or we're using their words. And so really being intentional about that as we kind of start the conversation today. And just as we're talking and knowing that, things are still evolving. That video that we showed you was about 4 or 5 years old now. And so there have been a lot of changes even since then, even with, additional two-spirit powwows and, those sorts of things. And so just remembering that, survivors should lead the conversation with language, and also that language is always evolving and folks are reclaiming language, and all those pieces are important too. So just wanted to kind of start us off and preface with that today. And I'll wait for Deb to get that PowerPoint back up for us. And so again, this really, this slide is just reiterating kind of what we just heard in the video, that two-spirit folks really is a term that is relatively new, but the existence of our two-spirit relatives is not new, right? And so kind of keeping that in mind and really, thinking back to some of what we heard in the video, and how even across, tribal nations and different cultures, words are going to be different. beliefs might be different, kind of how folks identify is going to be different. And so Two-Spirit was meant to be kind of this encompassing term for our Native relatives, that could be more of an empowering kind of reclaiming term, as opposed to some of those negative connotations and terms that had been used in years past. But like I said, listening to survivors and listening to how folks identify themselves is the most important in this. Next slide.
Yeah, and definitely just kind of going off of what Becky said, really listening to the survivor and learning from the survivor, maybe how their tribe, maybe their tribe's phrase for Two-Spirit. I was working with a Northern Cheyenne survivor, and I was really grateful that they were giving me some of their Cheyenne traditional history behind Two-Spirit. They really, we'll definitely get into this about the vulnerability and being targeted for violence later in the presentation, but the survivor was opening up to me about really how their grandmother was really supportive of their Two-Spirit identity ever since a child, and really really educating them about the traditional history, and really you belong here with us, so please don't listen to the hateful words of the community or other folks out. And no, they were sharing with me that Two-Spirit folks have really held held a honorable place in their society, with identifying as a man and a woman, and encompassing both perspectives, and being invited to council meetings, being invited to meetings where community decisions were being made. So I just thought that was beautiful, and I was really grateful that they were able to share that, and really highlighting the fact, or really highlighting the traditional belief of Two-Spirit, and how it could be unique to different tribes, and how that was just kind of lost in the assimilation and colonization practices.
Absolutely. And I think to this point here, checking our own assumptions and biases. I see a comment in the chat mentioning that just because someone is Indigenous or Native and they're part of the LGBTQ community doesn't mean that they're identifying or calling themselves Two-Spirit either, right? That, again, it's following the lead of the folks that you're talking to, of your family, of your friends, not making assumptions, right? When we see someone, and as we're going to get into, and we're going to talk about pronouns and gender and sexuality and all different types of things and terms and words, part of this is about taking that personal responsibility and doing some learning for ourselves too, right? We might be really familiar about some of what we're talking about today, and we may not be familiar. And so it's important to take that time and educate ourselves as well. And, just having resources, using language, having information that is as inclusive as you can. And remembering, like I said, things change and evolve all the time. And so the same is to be true with some of what we're going to talk about today. And I see Sarah here commenting, treat everyone like you'd want to be treated, and you'll go a long way. I feel like that is the theme of so much of this training, and especially what we're talking about today. It's just really being aware and understanding that, our biases and our beliefs don't need to determine how someone else sees themselves or identifies or lives their life, right? And so just, doing as much education as we can, being an ally where we can, being inclusive, and really just listening and learning and understanding, because we're always learning and growing. And so being a part of that is important as an advocate, and being a part of that public education is really important within this context. You can go to that next slide, Deb, if you want. I don't know if you want to talk about this, or if I can start us off, Shayla. I really love this visual. This is one that we used a lot in my work with youth, in our work on college campuses, in our work just in community, because it's a really great visual. So the gender unicorn kind of creates this, or shows us visually what we're talking about when we're speaking about things like gender, sexual orientation, expression, all of those kinds of things. And so if you look here, have some folks seen this? You can type in the chat if you've seen this visual before. So when we're thinking about our gender identity, so you see that illustrated, like that is how we view ourselves, right? So that is how I am seeing myself, viewing myself, what I think about myself. Gender expression is going to be that outward portrayal to the world, right? That might be how someone dresses, how someone carries themselves, like how, when we kind of think about what is traditionally feminine or masculine, right? Like that is how someone is, that's gender expression, right? Like how we dress or how we express ourselves, kind of our outward appearance. Then you have like your sex assigned at birth. Typically, in most situations, we're going to see that being female or male or maybe intersex. But we know one of the things with our conversation today is like gender and sexuality exist on a spectrum, right? I think a lot of times we have been taught that there is one or the other, right? There's female or male. And anything or anyone who identifies or exists outside of that, there's something wrong, right? Or they're different. But the reality is all of this exists on a spectrum, and each kind of piece of this is different, right? Our gender identity may not necessarily match the sex assigned at birth, or who we're physically attracted to might not line up with what society maybe has, how society has told us that it should, or how we express ourselves and portray ourselves may not line up with maybe how someone else might see us. And so kind of remembering all these different attributes and how, like I said, they all kind of exist on this spectrum. And so, and then when we're thinking about sexual orientation and like who we are attracted to romantically or sexually, there's physical attraction. Someone might be attracted to, someone who is a woman or someone who is a man or someone along, all along that spectrum. And that might differ from who they are attracted to emotionally as well, right? And so, as you can see, even started, like, I think sometimes this can feel complicated and complex, especially if you're just learning or just kind of understanding and learning some of the terminology. But I just go back to like, listen to who you're speaking to, right? Get education, go out and there's so much out there that you can read and so many folks that you can talk to. If you're really not sure, just ask questions, right? It's always, I think, better to ask than make assumptions. And so again, I really love this as a tool. And I think it's one of those tools that can be even great just to display like in your physical space, because it creates opportunity for conversation. It's that visual reminder, right? That we're kind of always thinking about, who we are, but also like who might be in front of us and who we might be working with or in relationship with. And so I really like this visual, and I think it kind of helps to illustrate in a way, like I said, that I've used with both youth and adults. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or kind of initial questions or reactions to this, or maybe how you've used it in your work or in your community or seen this or something similar used.
Becky Afton, there was a question in the chat. How does anyone know if your program has services for LGBTQ Two-Spirit?
Right. So I think that's where sometimes those visual cues can be important. What I wanted to say is like, it would be my hope that every program who is on and who is in existence is going to be providing service for all our relatives, right? Regardless of how we identify, how we look, how, all those things. So that's why I paused there for a minute, because we would want to make the assumption that anyone who is in need of services is able to come and they're going to find a safe space at our programs. But there are definitely like visual cues, like you're going to see a lot of places who might use even the rainbow flag, right? That's kind of the most like widely noticeable or recognizable visual symbol. You can see that reflected in your wording, maybe in what you say in your materials or your brochures or on your website, right? Like we serve all survivors, or we, you know, however you word that, you might see it reflected in your resources that you provide, right? Like in the images that you have, like around your space and in your materials. And then I think even in the learning that you do and the places you participate in your community. So are there places where maybe, you know, LGBTQ folks are gathering, like we talked about powwows, but sometimes there are like other events, like, are you having a table there? Are you showing up there? Like, are you interacting with the community as well, right? Like showing that you are a safe space and that you create a safe space. So I think a lot of it's about relationship mixed in with some of those visual cues. But I don't know, Shayla, like, what do you think about that? Like, how did you get that word out in your work?
I was thinking of how you said, like, really including visuals, you know, how you like the flag you mentioned, like how it's really widely known. And then also, even though in our brochures or when we're introducing our program, making sure we're using inclusive language instead of you know, like the YWCA, how the name is it's woman. So I always like just kind of took that and like making sure that we're being inclusive in all of our language and making sure that we're communicating that we serve all survivors and not just like gender exclusive, like strictly for women, or because you know the what am I trying to say, like violence happens against men, and you know, not a with the misconceptions that it doesn't. So really being inclusive, not only with our outreach, but having strong communication with the communities we serve, and having whether that's in brochures, our websites, even places that we're tabling in the outreach when we're going out, handing our information and handouts to folks.
Absolutely. And I see some folks are grabbing screenshots and photos of this. Like, you can get it online as well. And I know Deb and Steph will be sending it out in the follow-up materials too. So you can go to the next slide though, Deb. So pronouns, you know, we've already spent time talking about the importance of language, like all throughout this training, right? Not just on this topic, but language is important. And you know, how a person identifies and how a person sees themselves and how we see them, I think is important in relationship building. I think about, you know, the ways that, you know, I show up in space and how I want to be like able to be myself in the spaces that I come into. And I want folks that I'm with to be able to feel comfortable to be themselves as well. Right. And so, you know, sometimes, and I've seen a lot more often, you know, like creating spaces where like we aren't making those assumptions, right? Like, oh, well, you look, you know, like a female, or you look like a woman. So I'm going to use, you know, she, her pronouns with you. I'm going to say, oh, Shayla, you know, or when I talk about Shayla, I'm going to say she, her, right? But we shouldn't make assumptions. And so creating like opportunities for folks to share their pronouns, like that can be like, I think if you look even on our like our Zoom pictures at MUSAC, you know, we have our pronouns if folks want to show those, you know, in email signatures, in introductions, in meetings, you know, just different spaces, right? Like creating space where it's like the norm, right? A lot of places or meetings that we get on now, you know, they might just start off by saying, you know, I'm Becky, my pronouns are she, her, and, you know, whatever other introductions, and we just move on. And so sometimes it's just about creating that safe space and kind of like setting the tone, like just by even using pronouns, because I think even like identifying and using our pronouns is still new for some folks, right? And so by kind of like by you using your pronouns, like just like I said, in introductions or on your office door or whatever, it shows that like you have taken that step to be thinking about pronouns, right? And I think that in of itself is just another visual cue or like a you know, opportunity in relationship to kind of identify. And so there's a variety of pronouns that are listed here, but again, each person may identify differently based on, how, whatever they decide, however they decide to identify. So, typically, like when I'm introducing myself, I'll say I'm Becky. I use she, her pronouns, right? And you're going to see that's typically associated with like female or women, right? He, him, his, typically male, not always. They, them, theirs, sie, her, hers, sie, theirs, and many others, right? And so again, I think it's making space to do that learning and expand your own knowledge. We have one resource here on this slide, but again, there are so many resources out there where we can be learning. I think the biggest thing here is like just being respectful, right? I think, it says here, like actively ignoring someone's pronouns is harmful, right? So I don't want to like, why would that be, right? I don't want to answer that for you all. Why would that be? Why is actively ignoring or kind of discounting someone's pronouns harmful? Can you go back, please? Thank you. You can unmute or type in the chat.
Because I believe it's because nobody's acknowledging it.
Right. I mean, that's like if someone says, well, my name's Becky, and you say, no, it's not. Right? I mean, in a sense, because it's part of someone's identity. I see disrespectful because it can suggest their identity is not recognized or honored, right? The person being talked about feels misunderstood. It's like, you're not seeing me or you're not hearing me for who I am, right? I'm a person, I have value, I deserve respect, right? And it can seem like a small thing, but it isn't, right? It's how someone identifies. And so I think, there are situations where we might mess up, right? We might make assumptions and we might say, oh, or we're talking about someone and we say, oh, he, whatever, or he, she, those kinds of things. And we might get corrected, right? Someone may correct us and say, oh, actually, they use, they, them pronouns or, whatever it might be. And we, oh, okay, and now we make a note and we correct it going forward, right? It doesn't have to be, based on what I think or what I agree or how I feel about, how someone else should identify. Like, we are all entitled to our own identities in many ways. Like, our identities are multifaceted and our gender pronouns are just one part of our identity. But when you kind of brush off or don't acknowledge that, that's hurtful, right? It's harmful. And so, like I said, it's, our gender pronouns and identity is just one part of us, but it is a part of us. And so, just being respectful. I'm still going to go back to that first comment, like just be a nice person. And it can be really distracting. Sometimes there's a comment about when someone mispronounced someone, right? I was somewhere where an elder was told and corrected themselves, but kept forgetting. And it can be, and sometimes folks' pronouns change, right? They might change and evolve. Like I said, this is, identity is fluid. Like, so maybe I used to identify with in one way and now I identify in another way, right? And once I've told you that, you have that information, right? And you may forget, but the onus is kind of on you then, once someone lets you know that, whether that's in writing or they verbally tell you. And so, kind of repeatedly like messing up or disrespecting can be distracting or can feel offensive, even if it's not meant to be. And so just kind of, doing your best, helping support others as they're learning. I think that's really the most important part of this. Just
I really like how you mentioned that, Becky, like that relationship building, and it's definitely okay to ask in case if you do have, or I don't want to say it like that, it's okay to ask, but if you don't want to assume, but like reaching out in a respectful way just to clarify.
And I'll tell you honestly, I have almost gone to exclusively using they, them pronouns when I speak about other folks, like who aren't, like if I'm speaking about someone to someone like, oh, I was with my coworker Shayla and they, like I may use they many times, just like now out of habit almost because I don't know. It does. It makes it easier and it's not hurting anything, right? I do see that hand. Don't see who it is, but go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, hi, my name is Omi. So I use they them pronouns and I just wanted to share like a tip for anyone else who maybe they want to share their pronouns, but it can be a little bit awkward sometimes to like just be like, oh, by the way, these are my pronouns, like interrupt a conversation. So something that I do that just kind of is a easy transition is I'll just ask their pronouns. Like I'll say like, "Oh, hi, like what's your pronouns?" And then when they answer, I'll say like, "Okay, cool, these are mine." And it just feels a lot more less vulnerable than just like starting out with your own pronouns first. So that might help some people out.
Love that. Thank you for sharing. And again, it's just another part of who we are, right? And so creating those spaces where it does feel safe, like that was a great example, where it doesn't take a lot of effort on our part, and we're creating a safe space for conversation and for relationship building. So thank you for sharing. We can go to the next slide, Dan. You can go to the next one. I think maybe we're just delayed. Go back one, Deb, sorry. So terminology, I'll just keep speaking, and Afton, Shayla, you just jump in or interrupt me or anyone on the call. We started out talking about Two-Spirit and what that means and kind of a little bit of the history. And but one thing that I have learned is that, again, like we've said, I feel like I've said this like a repeating record, like terminology is ever evolving and ever changing. I have numerous folks in my family who identify as gay, lesbian, etc. My mom being one, and even the terminology that she has used throughout her life has kind of ebbed and flowed, right? Like some terminology, I think, like we're seeing like folks reclaiming, like we see queer here. That is a term that I know some of our older relatives have, like really don't use as often just because it has had that like derogatory term, right? And so even when we're looking here on, this list, like this is not an all-encompassing list, and not every individual who may, so gay, right? Typically we think of, or historically gay has been thinking of a male and a male relationship, but I have many friends who are in relationships and they say they're gay, right? Well, that's, it may mean that it's two women, it may mean it's two men, it may mean, whatever that might mean. And so thinking about that, I think is important in the sense of, again, it's asking, it's not making assumptions. And so, we've got gay here on the list, lesbian. Typically that's going to mean a relationship or a situation where it's two women, right? Bisexual, usually someone who is bi, meaning like attracted to both sexes, right? Or genders, depending on. And so, same thing, queer. There are kind of a lot of terms that might be associated with queer. We've got on here like gender queer, non-binary, gender non-conforming. And so, a lot of those terms are more along the lines of like kind of that spectrum, right? Like non-binary. So not maybe subscribing to like this one or the other idea, right? Like fluidity within that. And so I think just thinking about, even how ways that we identify and terminology we use changes over time. Pansexual, so folks who are attracted kind of across the spectrum, could be sexually or emotionally, questioning. Sometimes you'll see LGBTQIA, like all different kind of letters represented. So Q typically will mean questioning. So that might be someone who's not quite certain, like where their identity may lie or where their attraction might lie. And so they're kind of in this like questioning space. Asexual, referring to folks who aren't like, don't identify any sexual attraction, right, to anyone. So they may have emotional relationships, but not sexual. Aromantic, kind of, I don't want to say the opposite, but in the same sense where they're not identifying romantic relationships, but maybe strictly sexual or maybe some other type of relationship. Cisgender, that is someone who identifies with the gender in which they were, or the sex that they were assigned at birth, right? And so if I am born and identified as a female, I identify female, that's cisgender, right? Transgender, someone who is identifying with the sex or gender that is different from what they were assigned at birth, typically. And intersex are those folks who are kind of falling somewhere in between, right? Unfortunately, many times in our medical system, there is this want, and not even only in our medical system, in society, right? We have this like gender reveal parties and all these kinds of things, like to determine, like, is this person, is this baby, is this, you know, are they male or are they female? And again, like there's not a lot of conversation about like, what if they're neither? Or what if they're both, right? Or how, you know, what does that look like? And so intersex are those folks who kind of are somewhere on that spectrum, right? Their sex organs, they may have female sex organs and some like male physical traits, right? Or vice versa, those kinds of things. Or they may have genitalia that at their birth, doctors just weren't quite, you know, sure, or maybe they chose for them one way or the other. And you'll see that kind of with like gender assignment at birth many times, right? And I'm sure many of us have heard different stories and situations about like how that has gone for folks, right? Especially when there is this kind of like pressure, right? Societal pressure, medical pressure to like make a determination. I think we are hearing about it more and more, where there are parents or folks who are more open, able, willing, whatever it might be, to raising their children if maybe they're not sure, or they want their children to kind of have the opportunity to identify for themselves. And so, you know, you may see kind of just more general gender terminology used even, right, within raising children. And so again, there are so many bits and pieces of this. I am not a medical doctor, so I am not going to, you know, give a huge explanation about what it means to be intersex, other than to say, like I said, you know, we all exist on a spectrum. All bodies look different, including, you know, how we, you know, what our physical traits are, what our internal organs may look like, what our sex organs look like. And so, you know, we all just are unique and, you know, made how we are made. So I don't know if Shayla or Afton have anything additional to say about any of these terms. And there are so many more that aren't on this list.
No, I think you covered a lot. I've been especially silent because I think you've approached everything with so much grace and clarity, that it all makes sense and has been pairing well nice with the comments from everybody. So I think it's all coming together very nicely and explaining things for both those with previous experience as well as those learning for the first time. So thank you.
Awesome. And I love this comment here. Is it from Jenna Lee? That is talking about kind of the most widely accepted acronyms being LGBTQ+ or LGBTQIA2S+, and encouraging folks, especially when you're working or those working with Indigenous populations, to kind of flip that acronym and put Two-Spirit first, right? So Two-Spirit LGBTQ+ or Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+. And I love that you said that. And I actually had one of our presenters say that to us as well here at MUSAC. And so I was just reviewing a grant narrative before I did this session, and I went through that grant and I did that exact same thing anywhere that it was mentioned, because I think it is important, right? Like it calls attention to our two-spirit relatives, right? And I think it's important that we are embracing like that part of our culture. And I love that you said that specifically. And so, I mean, it's those what may seem like small things that are so important. And so I love that you said that. Let's see, I've seen some acronyms used, LGBTQIA2S+. Is that acceptable term or prefer? So just like we just said, like kind of flipping that to have two-spirit in the front of that acronym. Really, again, I think it's having knowledge, being as inclusive as you can be, and always, continuing to learn and educate yourself, right? And so that same thing is going to come with acronyms too. Like if you are genuinely doing your best and trying to learn, I think you're going to find that few people are going to like come at you or fault you if they say, well, why didn't you have, why didn't you include the T here? Why, and if folks do, make that correction and you've learned and move on, right? That's the best that we can do. But I think it is, you're going to see, again, a spectrum, both within the community and within, providers who are serving community. I feel like I'm not giving you a great answer, but it really does depend. But I have been trying to be more intentional, especially working in this space, about using the two-spirit or the 2S in front. So love that comment. Next slide, Deb. So that slide is, this one is really just kind of looking at rates of violence, right? And again, I think some of these we've probably touched on throughout our time together. But, specifically calling attention to this last one here, that 85% of our two-spirit LGBTQ relatives have experienced sexual assault, right? And so what does that mean for the services that we're providing at our program? And what does that mean for, how important it is to be doing our learning and doing our work and thinking about our outreach and thinking about, the services that we provide and how we speak about them. Like it's important, right? And so especially, I think always one of the most interesting things, like looking at maybe like your service numbers or your data, right? Or anytime we're looking at statistics, is like our most marginalized populations of our already marginalized populations, right, tend to have higher rates of violence, like in whatever context we're speaking about. And so I think it's always thinking about what can we do to create these spaces where it is safe for all of our relatives to come forward and ask for services and, feel accepted and see a place for them in our spaces. Because I've even seen, some of the reports even higher than 85%. And I know in our youth trafficking work that we were doing, we had, upwards of 80 to 90% of the youth that we were working with were identifying as two-spirit or LGBTQ. And we did not have a single, youth who hadn't experienced some type of assault or violence, right? And that was just in that kind of specific population. And so, I think it's just, again, it's being really highly attuned to the fact that not only are our relatives marginalized or kind of, experiencing, difficulties because of their identity and just who they are, right? Now, they're, and I should say in addition, they're subjected to these higher rates of violence and discrimination and racism and all these other pieces. And so it's just, again, it's just being aware of that. Next slide. Did you want to talk about this, Shayla?
Yeah, so on the previous slide, we talked about more than 85% experiencing sexual assault and violence. And, barriers to reporting a family member may be hard. You might be still living with that family member, or just, the effects it could have on the family dynamic. And then the fear of being blamed or shamed for your assault. And working with survivors, we've heard a lot of shaming and blaming due to their identity, and blaming that as part of their assault. Confidentiality, maybe they haven't safely expressed their identity yet, so the fear of that information being relayed to their family, their community, not being protected within the criminal justice system. I was working with a two-spirit, or that was their identity, two-spirit. I was working with a two-spirit survivor, and because they presented taller, the police officer was like, "Are you sure they were physically assaulted?" And so just like that kind of oppression of not respecting an identity, or not like discrimination of their identity. Fear of having to out themselves to report, we talked about that. Maybe they haven't safely expressed their identity, or not ready to, but when you are, sorry, my dog is being really needy right now. There was a cat that was teasing him on our porch, and I'm just like, she left. And then even like threats from the perpetrator of expressing their sexual identity without their consent. And then past negative experiences with the system, long history of discrimination, understanding of maybe they won't get help if they reach out again. And we talked about systems not being set up for our the LGBTQ plus community, so trying to make it more inclusive so that they do feel safe to reach out for services. Afton, did I leave out anything? Becky, Afton?
No, I do think when we talk about double jeopardy when it comes to carrying multiple identities, being both Indigenous and Two-Spirit as well, is that it can often be weaponized. Just like as Shayla said, and just like how the slides are, is that often it would become less of a concern for people, but more of something to weaponize rather than getting justice for folks. Like I've seen so many times on social media and other ways where the way someone presents themselves becomes the topic, rather than about how can we best support this person and how are we identifying this victim survivor, rather than looking at the outward appearance or how they identify themselves. So there are a lot of ways and a lot of reasons why someone would take a step back from sharing, and even going into what does a forensic exam look like? What does it look like to have your identity affirmed in a place where there's a lot of it's invasive in nature. So I think you got a lot of it.
I love that example, Afton, about like when you think about like systems, right? Like a medical setting, like I mean, that can have a huge impact. A sane exam in general can be, a very, very difficult thing to go through. Let alone hoping and trusting that whoever your provider is going to have some training or some understanding, right? If you might present different than what maybe they might be expecting, or whatever that might be, right? And so I think some of those barriers, like thinking broadly about like what systems might be, right? Like our, systems that are set up as, for support, maybe some of those places where folks are experiencing some of the, some of the most barriers, even at times, just in like that whole kind of fear-based and what is said out in public. Like I think that's why it can be so kind of even going back to the beginning of this time together today, where we talked about like just outreach and where are you out in the community, right? When folks are seeing you out in community and saying like, oh, this person or this program or this partner, that whoever they do care about us, right? They care about us as members of the community. They're supporting us. I think it means a lot to show up, right? And to be thinking and asking the questions. Like, the onus should not be on the victims, right? Regardless of where we are in the system. And so the same thing to be, the onus of kind of breaking some of these barriers down should not be on our Two-Spirit LGBTQ relatives, right? To have to continuously be like fighting against, like, we should be creating a space that is safe for anyone who's coming forward and needing services. And so I think that's part of, I think what is coming up next is just kind of talking about our internal systems and processes. You can go to the next slide, Deb. We're close. I think this is really just kind of looking back at some of what we talked about, right? And what it looks like for folks who might be coming up against some of these barriers, right? Like, depending on what is still existing. In the video, they talked about the two individuals who were trying to get married, right? They were just going to get married, and they had to fight against laws and tribal codes that were in existence just to do what many people in this country like wouldn't think twice about, right? Like, it's a privilege to be able to do that. And so just thinking about like what the legal ramifications might be, or what laws are on the books in certain places, or what tribal codes, and this law enforcement misgendering or causing further harm. We haven't really, at least today in this section, we're not really getting too deep into like hate crimes and all those other kinds of things. But I mean, I think, that's huge, right? Like, thinking of all those situations, and the situations that we hear about, like where folks are being misgendered, are being treated horribly, or being violently attacked, or being put in unsafe situations, like during incarceration or during holding or arrests, like those kinds of things, right? Like, those are all extremely real. And, like, scary and sometimes life-threatening situations that folks are finding themselves in if they're reaching out for support, right? Like, that's if, and it may be a situation where they didn't have a choice, right? Where there was law enforcement intervention or some other kind of intervention. And so they're being put in these situations where they're having to disclose information or be.
Oh, Becky, you went on mute.
I said the same to be said for service providers. I think, over the years, I've worked with lots of different programs and shelter programs and, places where we're creating safe space for our relatives, where we're talking about, well, we can't have, this person here, or we can't have this person here, or, whatever that might be. And really exploring, like, why is that, right? Is that your personally held beliefs, or is it misunderstandings, right? Is it an issue like that needs to be addressed somewhere in your policy, right? Like, I think education is so huge in some of these situations and these barriers. And so thinking about your own policies and procedures, right? Like, is someone ineligible? Or are you deeming them ineligible for services because of your perception of them or their identity, or, who they are, and whether or not they're going to be a fit, right? For like a air quote there, for your program or for your shelter. I mean, really think about that, because, once, there's a response, right? Where someone is, maybe like mistreated or turned away or whatever, like that experience gets out, right? Folks tell other folks about that. And so then it's, oh, well, this program isn't going to let you go there, or, they're not going to help you, or whatever that might be. And so I just encourage you to have those conversations, like, and those, kind of like thinking about that ahead of time. So it's not in the moment, right? Like, what is your policy on trans folks at your shelter, if you have one, right? Do you have a policy? Do you need one? Like, but like, you don't want to be having to have that conversation in the midst of someone who is going through a crisis, right? And so, having those conversations, like, and really examining, like, why some policies or codes or whatever it might be are in practice, right? Like, is there a reason for some things to exist, or is it like just outdated biases, right? Use the next slide.
Oh, I have one thing to add on that.
Ooh.
Oh, that's okay. We can stay on this slide too. Sorry. But one of the things that I kind of want to share is I came from a clinic that was Native specific. And so as an advocate, I kind of just worked within the realm of the clinic. And so many times that we heard is that even when it comes to the identification that you need to access services, your preferred name will not be included because it needs to match your birth certificate or your state ID. And so there are community hubs that will allow you to have a community card to kind of verify your identity for placement. But a lot of time is not sufficient enough because your gender identity or your biological sex is not included. And so there's a lot of discrepancies when it comes to how you're identifying and how you're receiving those services, and how you're having a preferred name and your gender is super important, and having those conversations with your staff. So while the service provider is giving the care, that there are no hiccups in making sure that person is getting a well-rounded service while taking account their full identity and their full needs as a victim survivor. So I just want to share that. Oh, it makes sense then, right? Okay. We were like blink, blink. And I've just been like, I have a cough drop in my mouth, not feeling the best, but advocacy for Two-Spirit LGBTQ victim survivors. Make sure your approach is sincere, non-judgmental, confidential connection. Remember that we exist in a world where people are dying because of their identities and the hatred in the world. And that when someone comes to you for assistance and help, that you maintain that confidential connection and that you're listening and not leading, because we want to make sure that we're getting the best care and the safest for our relatives. Educate yourself about the community language. Being here for the 40 hours, one step. When we have a commitment to advocating for our people, that also includes our Two-Spirit relatives. So being here today is an example of learning about the language, being open and transparent that I don't know everything, but let me take this time and ask because this is the appropriate time to ask questions. Just like Becky said, not while we're kind of like fumbling the ball when we're trying to get care for a relative. So address fears about law enforcement or medical responses and prepare to inform them about procedures. The entire process of law enforcement as well as medical responses and forensic exams are already kind of a realm where there's a lot of confusion in general. And that's why SART teams, that's why there are large responses, because to make sure that everyone is kind of on the same page. So do your due diligence, learning about to expand your own advocacy, learning about law enforcement, medical responses, so you can best convey them to folks who do fall within the spectrum and those who biologically may differ than the general population. And let's see, address homophobic or unprofessional treatment. If you're with the victim survivor when this happens, ask how they feel about you addressing it now or how they would prefer to do it later. One of the things that we've really been talking about, I know internally at MUSAC, in other spaces, especially in our community practice calls, is that sometimes it's best to really take a second and debrief. And we don't want to make any alarming. Well, let me take a step back. Let me finish this. Remember the principles of advocacy: experts in their own lives, self-determination, make their own decisions, follow your gut, respect the victim. So once again, just following the lead, what is needed, and get to know the people around you and have those conversations, if appropriate, at the right time. Read the room and listen to who you're there to advocate for. Is there anything you want to add, Becky or Shayla? I know Shayla.
I really love that address educating yourself, because we like how Afton mentioned, we have folks dying because of their identity, and how Becky mentioned like the oh my gosh, I had this all in my head just before I unmuted. No, the discrimination faced when getting resources, and really checking our own biases when they enter our doors. And what I mean by checking bias is like really not being that second place of harm and turning them back to their situation, maybe experiencing homelessness, or being that oh my gosh, the continuum of violence. Sorry, that's just where my head was going.
No, I love that. And I mean, I think that is the thing. Like, sometimes we can do more harm than help when we are like, or even if it's, I love that it says on that last point, follow your gut, respect the victim, follow up no matter what, right? Like checking in with them and checking in with your partners in this work, right? Like, or some, a colleague in your office. If someone says something that is unprofessional or homophobic or just downright hurtful, like say something, right? Have that conversation, because it could be like, it really is as serious as a life and death conversation sometimes, I think. And like, I'm not trying to be overly dramatic here, but like we are all who we are, and we all deserve respect. And especially when we're in those times when when we're experiencing violence or we're being harmed, right? If someone is seeking you out because they believe that you are someone who can help them, like be that person who can help them, and do your best not to do any additional harm, like whatever that means. Like that's I feel like that's part of being an advocate, right? Is just standing up and doing what's right, and helping those who are in those situations where they're just needing extra help at the time. So you can go to the next slide. So this was that slide that I was talking about a while back. Just thinking about things that you can do in your own organization, and doing some of that work and having those conversations ahead of time. And that could be, within your staff meetings, it could be in like a SART team, like Afton talked about. It could be, out in the public, it could be in your school, it could be, like wherever that, opportunity might present itself. But just thinking about, who are our services set up for, right? And, or who are our services maybe not set up for is maybe a better question. Thinking about, like what, who do we serve, and what, how do we serve folks, and what is available for folks, like having all those conversations on the front end. So we're not having to have them, with someone sitting in our office or coming to our shelter, or who's at our shelter and needs a safe place to stay, right? And then, whatever is determined in that time, like know ahead what you can and can't do. Some of them can be like, I say as simple as, right? But like as simple as gender inclusive bathrooms or facilities, right? Like thinking about the places, like where can we just have space that there's just space for folks? Like when do we need to have certain separations in place, right? What's appropriate? But also like, what are those times where we can have spaces that are open to all, who need them, right? Like, what does that look like in our facilities? And again, it's just that visual like representation, right? Having signage, brochures, media, we talked about a lot of that already, but really being intentional, right? I think one of the most helpful things that I have found in designing materials for organizations throughout the years is like, if there is a population or a group of folks that you're feeling like, oh, we're not doing the best job maybe in doing outreach, like who better to ask to evaluate your materials than the folks that you maybe aren't necessarily reaching, right? Like ask, like, what do you think? Like, what could we do better? Would you come to us for services? Like, again, we're not making assumptions, right? We're like having these safe conversations with folks, but like ask people, ask your community, put yourselves out there, and to just say like, how are we doing? Are we doing a good job? Are we doing not so good? Because people, you know, if you create that safe space, I think people generally will tell you, right? And again, if it's meant in a way that's meant to help improve services, right? Like constructive criticism is okay. And I think it's helpful like to hear from folks if we have areas for growth. So thinking even just like about like our forms, like things as simple as that, right? Like sometimes we're handing over forms or we're asking questions or, you know, whatever that is, like thinking critically about like what questions do we need to ask? What information do we need to have in order to do our job? Sometimes we have to collect information because a grant might require it or whatever, right? But like think about the way that you can collect the information from folks. Like, does everything have to be a checkbox? Can you have blank spaces where folks can write things in or draw things in or, you know, whatever they might need to be, like not only for like gender or sex or whatever that might be on forms, but like in as many spaces as you can. We did a really intentional like overhaul of all of our like policies or signage or intake forms, like all of that at the program that I was working with and went through and we were like, where are all the places where we can like just eliminate this, it's option A, B, or C, right? Sometimes it just is, right? But like if there's a line or if there's a way that you can just like leave it open for folks, if there were things that weren't required or weren't necessary, we tried to eliminate that, right? Like there is some information you need, but there's a lot of information that we gather from people, I think sometimes that we don't need, right? And so just really, again, like looking critically at what you have, looking at your policies, making sure that you have policies in place that include sexual orientation and gender identity, right? Making sure that there are protections in place because there are protections in place for folks and making sure that you're following the law. If you see something that needs to be reported, report it. And then just having, again, practices or protocols in place if there are problematic situations or problematic staff, right? Sometimes there are folks who maybe just aren't at a point in their learning or don't want to be or whatever that might be where they're maybe just not the right fit or they're not the right fit for some clients or whatever that might be, right? Like, but have those conversations because again, we don't want to be another place where someone is experiencing victimization when they're looking for help. I don't know if there's any other thoughts on that or things that you all have done or even others, you know, in the chat or unmute yourself that you've seen work well, or you've seen work not so well, or just like learnings for folks thinking about this at their own organizations. Feel free to share if you have any. I do see Afton here as put in the chat about equity assessments are a must to consider where there are areas that need growth and consider the unintended outcomes that might result from gaps in inclusivity. Absolutely. Like we're always just getting better, right? Like we said at the beginning, we're always learning. You know, we're always evolving. We're, you know, changing our knowledge and responses based on the new things that we learn. And we're just, you know, trying to do a better job for survivors. And so whatever we need to do to make that happen, like, let's do that and let's create, you know, more safe spaces. Next slide. So this, I believe, is just language that is pulled from the Department of Justice, talking about providing services to all folks. A recipient may not make a determination about services for one survivor based on the complaints of another survivor when those complaints are based on gender identity, right? So basically saying that, you know, that can't be the basis for you saying, well, this person says that they aren't comfortable with this person receiving services here or whatever, and so we're not serving them, right? Like, that's not allowed. We can go to the next slide. So implications for change. And I also see a comment in the chat, which I think fits right into this. The comment says, some cisgender people at my work seem resistant to share their pronouns. Their reasoning is that they will just call people by their names and that should be good enough. I'm never sure how to respond to that. What do we think, folks? How would you respond to that? Or Afton or Shayla or anyone else?
I would say, let's see. Becky, I understand this may be new, but this is a procedure that we're establishing to make all feel welcome. So if you could do your best and put in practice of introducing your pronouns along with your name so we can get to know each other. Or else, no, I'm just kidding.
I like that, Afton, because then I also was thinking of like being inclusive, being everyone introducing their pronouns.
And again, like our name, it's just a part of our identity. And I mean, there's people out there who don't maybe want to even use their name, right? Like, again, I'm not trying to like downplay the importance, but like it's a part of identity. And I think being respectful, and again, creating those safe spaces. And I love that you like how you modeled that, Afton, and just kind of giving that like, it's something we're trying on and we're all learning, and like we just really want you to learn along with us. Like, I think that is helpful in like bringing folks in, right? As opposed to like starting like but I mean, because I think like then it gets to be like tense and, but I loved how you said that. That was awesome. So just thinking about implications for change, again, like, do you have an organizational philosophy on how you're going to respond to all survivors, right? But we're specifically talking about our Two-Spirit LGBTQ relatives. What is your philosophy? Do you have one? Have you had conversations? Have you, do you provide training and education ongoing to your staff, right? Like, we're never done learning. Like I'm learning things in this presentation as we're all talking together, right? And so like, what does that look like to have a philosophy just about like how you're gonna provide good services and improve your knowledge? Like, just be thinking about that. Meeting with healthcare providers and SANES to learn about their training, and seeing whether they feel confident and comfortable working with LGBTQ Two-Spirit relatives. Now we reversed it on that one. Like, I think that's so important because again, like we talked about, a lot of harm can come and has come in the medical field as well, for some of our relatives. And so, having those conversations, like I love saying like, like what kind of training do you have? Is that something that you are comfortable with? Do you feel confident? Like, could we work together? Are there, places that, we could have further conversation. I remember one of the projects that was so great that we ended up doing with one of our hospitals that we worked with and their SANE program specifically was we looked at I can't think of what it's called, but the paperwork essentially that you fill out, right? It's got like the body, on there and you're like circling things and doing all that during exams. And we just were like, can this just be like, more neutral? Like, is there space for some of this to be gender neutral where it can be, right? Because also remembering like not all bodies look the same, right? And so like, even just in like how they were indicating, things during exams and evidence collection, right? Like it kind of changed the conversation that they were having with folks and really, again, like not making assumptions about like what had happened during an assault even, right? Or like how someone should be receiving care, right? Like based on their physical appearance, right? And so, I mean, again, it can be those things where you think like, well, this is just how it has to be, but sometimes it doesn't. Like a conversation can go a long way sometimes, and especially with some of our partners that we're working with. Meeting with law enforcement to understand what their training and policies look like in their work. You know, like what kinds of questions they ask, how they ask questions, what they require. I love that. I think it was Afton that mentioned like talking about like identification even, right? And the challenges that can come along when folks' identification maybe doesn't match up. You know, or if someone's being, you know, detained or stopped for something else, and then it becomes this huge issue, right? Like what kind of training and support can we be providing for law enforcement specifically, so that we help ensure that they're partners in this work also. Same thing with our mental health practitioners. I think we've talked about this throughout this training, like have a conversation, especially before we're just referring folks. You know, we want to have a conversation with the folks that we're making referrals to, groups that we're making referrals to, other entities in the community that might provide resources. Like, you know, like I'm always so apprehensive to do like those blind like handoffs of someone like, oh, call this place. They say they're a XYZ resource center. They must, you know, be able to help. Like do a little bit of research and homework first, right? Like have some conversation and you know, don't just like blindly send our relatives off to a place just based on a name, right? Like, oh, this must be a place that can provide you more assistance. Like, you know, go there. Like Afton said, absolutely site visits, like see the places, go and, you know, have conversations and be in that space too. So, you know, what you're talking about. You know, again, talking with our judges, our prosecutors, our lawmakers, thinking about policy and legislative change, like lots of things can come when, you know, many people are raising their voices. And I think that it's important, again, you know, for some of our relatives who have just like experienced, you know, challenges and barriers within so many aspects, right? And in so many places that some of us just take for granted, right? And so thinking about, you know, how can we be, you know, if it's not a community that we are a part of, how can we be allies at the very least in this work and just in, you know, again, being good relatives.
I really like how you said that, like being, I mean, like being good relatives and how could we be an ally? And definitely with that policy and legislation change, you know, with all of the overlying, layers to sexual assault that our LGBTQ plus, and two-spirit relatives face, like lack of housing, you know, discrimination when applying for housing. You know, we talked a lot about the high, amount of homelessness, and then just like examining those other barriers that factor into sexual assault, you know, being closed out from their community, being targeted for violence and physical attacks. So really just really not only educating but connecting with your community and other surrounding communities for resources and how to be an ally, and really along with that policy and legislation, just highlighting all the other factors that go into sexual assault that they face discrimination from, like medical services, shelter services.
Love that. Next slide, Deb, please. I think we might be going backwards. I don't know, Afton or Shayla, if you want to wrap it up. This is our last slide for this section, and we're getting everyone finished maybe early.
Okay.
So-
Changing the narrative, and this is a quote by Deb Holland. I'm a proud mom of a queer daughter who very candidly told me she didn't come out formally because she felt she shouldn't have to. Straight people don't have to come out, she said. She made a good point. Today is about being proud of who you are. I look forward to the day when no one has to come out anymore because everyone is visible and loved. Congresswoman, New Mexico.
I love that. I think like that is like so, I mean, like simple and also profound, right? Like, especially because we've been talking so much just about, you know, identities and all of these pieces. But we make a lot of assumptions about folks until we don't, right? We have this idea about like what is the norm and what is socially acceptable, and anything or anyone who falls outside of that for whatever reason kind of has this like, well, we need to have an explanation, right? Like we need to know more. We need to, you know, have more information so we can figure out kind of what box to fit you in, or however you want to say it. And so I love it. I think that is, it's just the more and more that we can do to just, you know, be inclusive and create spaces where, you know, we're just in relation with one another and being respectful and able to be our true selves. Like, I mean, I feel like that's even a part of prevention in a sense, right? Because to your point, Shayla, like talking about all those intersecting factors, like if someone is supported and loved and, you know, has a safe place to be, right? Like, how does that impact, you know, future homelessness and all those kinds of things, right? Like there's so many intersections. So I really do like this quote and kind of this whole conversation with you all today. This has been fun. So does anyone have any just kind of like final thoughts? Like I said, I know we are probably ending a little bit early, but you've all, you know, heard a lot and talked about a lot today. Becky says here in the chat, you know, like you owe us an explanation of who you are. Nope, just like we don't ever explain to them who we are. Absolutely. Any other final thoughts? Well, please feel free if you have any questions to reach out to Deb or Steph or any of us. I think they will be sending a variety of resources over. You'll have the recording, you'll have that video. There'll be lots of information coming your way as always. And so if there's anything else that we can offer, otherwise I would just say thank you to Shayla and Afton. I'm glad this worked out. And Afton, I'm glad you were able to be on with us, even though you're being pulled in many directions, because you have a lot to contribute to the conversation. So thank you both for letting me be on with you.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Afton, Shayla, and Debbie. Very much. We are getting done a little bit early, but I'm pretty sure nobody's going to be too mad about that. Thank you all the participants. Next week, this week on Thursday, we will be going over advocate self-burnout and the core skills of advocacy. And that is our last day with everybody. So thank you all. We will be staying on for that debrief, an optional debrief if you'd like to hang out with us, give us any feedback or, you know, talk to us. We will also, I'll be sending out those slides in the follow-up today. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.